Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm and you are watching What If Naruto Changed After Tsunade's Passing. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Not wasting no more time, let's start the story.
It began shortly after the Kyuubi incident, and the widespread release of demonic energy at that time had an unanticipated consequence. It initially affected the shinobi who had survived the battle, but it soon spread to the general public as well. An organ failure epidemic. All traditional treatments failed because the cause was demonic in origin. Not even the renowned physician Tsunade could find a cure. Tens of thousands perished, and the death toll was continuously increasing. Like all major tragedies, however, there was hope. Nin Orochimaru, who had gone missing, had discovered a method for growing new organs artificially. As a result, the Sannin was accepted as a hero back in the village and given amnesty for his previous transgressions. Thus, Gene Company was established and the village was spared. However, the process of creating new organs was costly and time-consuming. The man could not be paid in full by anyone. This wasn't an issue, though, because Gene Co. provided a simple financing method. However, a clause that still haunts the world today was concealed in the fine print. Because the organ would be repossessed and returned to Gene Co. property if you failed to make even one payment. The third Hokage, who had assumed power following the passing of his successor, initially lived and outlawed repossessions. Orochimaru responded by closing Gene Company, and the Hokage was compelled to legalize repossessions when the death toll began to rise once more. Before long, the Snake Sannin was among the richest and most influential men in the village, and Gene Company was once again open for business. But that was 12 years ago, and now purchasing new organs is a fashion statement. As a result, there is always someone who is behind on their payments and works for the repo man. The day in the Leaf Hidden Village was especially bright. And so it should be, as today was the day the Shinobi Academy was supposed to graduate the next generation of ninja. And there were some well-known faces in this year's graduating class. Sakura Haruno was the first, despite the fact that her ninja status did not contribute to her fame. No, even though her career was just getting started, she soon established herself as Gene Co.'s spokesperson and was frequently present at the majority of the company's public events. Not to be overlooked was Kiba Inzuaka, Orochimaru's adopted son. In a selfless gesture, Orochimaru took the clan's heir as his own after the majority of the Inzuaka clan perished. Most people concur that this was merely a publicity stunt on his part, but the fact remains that Kiba, his son, had grown up thinking, and perhaps correctly, that he was above the law and had a minor issue with violent outbursts. As an example, he scolded Mizuki, the assistant teacher, last week for looking at him funny. Last but not least was the blonde who sat at the back of the class and had a dejected expression. The late Tsunade's adopted son, Naruto Uzumaki Senju, is expected to rank among the best medical professionals the Academy has produced since his mother passed away. However, because of a specific fuzzball that is locked away in his gut, he is not as skilled at controlling his chakras. Instead, he had concentrated on doing things the old-fashioned way, and as a result, he had mastered the use of scalpels and other surgical instruments in both the field of medicine and combat. But right now, all he could think about was her and how much his failure had cost him. But before his grief could overwhelm him, their teacher entered their room through the open door. Naruto mentally prepared himself by shaking his head and concentrating on the man in front of the room. He knew that she would be upset if he failed something as basic as the graduation exam if she was still alive. Since he still couldn't make the dame things and only passed because his mother taught him the Kagebushin, Naruto reasoned that perhaps he shouldn't disparage the test, even though it had been incredibly simple. Really, make some bushin and you're a genin, he thought. Even so, they could have at least added some difficulty. He was now waiting for his late sensei to arrive while seated with his two new teammates. His left was occupied by the rising vocals and voice of Gene Co. Haruno Sakura. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that he had for a while believed he was in love with the pink-haired singer and that he might still be if his circumstances weren't what they were. However, he was no longer seeking love and wasn't stupid enough to believe that a loving relationship was in his future. Sasuke Uchiha, the last member of his clan and a moody baster, was seated on his right. But when Naruto considered it, he had been acting in that manner for almost a year, so he had no right to start griping about other people doing the same. He saw that their sensei was now 2.5 hours late when he sent another bored look at the clock on the wall. Naruto lowered his head back on the desk and once more withdrew into his thoughts, wondering why he had joined this team. The Snake Man most likely pulled some strings to have his star singer assigned for the same reasons, so I'm lucky to be here to keep the all-powerful Uchiha alive long enough to begin rebuilding his clan. At that moment, a man with some of the strangest hair Naruto had yet to see and a covered face peered in through the open door. He vanished in a cloud of smoke after saying, "My first impression of you guys is, you're rather dull. Meet me up on the roof in 5. Naruto asked the others, "I take it that was our new sensei?" He only received a shoulder shrug from Sakura and a HN from Sasuke before they both stood up and left the room, Naruto trailing closely behind. After a few more flights of stairs, the three of them were seated in front of their sensei. The tall, lanky man said, "Let's get introductions out of the way first, with a strange expression on the only part of his face that Naruto could identify as a smile. The girl with the thin pink hair said, Sensei, why don't you go first? So we know what to do." He just kind of trailed off at the end, but Naruto swore he heard the man giggle. "Well now how about you Pinky?" he asked, pointing at her. "Oh, well my name's Hakate, SP. Kakashi. My likes are none of your business. Same go for dislikes. I have a few hobbies and dreams for the future, well." This was the first time he had noticed, but now that he was looking, he could tell they were Gene Company products. Not many people would be able to tell the difference, but in his line of work it was somewhat necessary. "Ah well, my name's Sakura Haruno, I like my eyes," he said. "And," she said, turning to face the sullen Uchiha, "I don't like Ino.Pig, and as for future dreams," she said, turning back to face the Uchiha and letting out a little sigh. With a chuckle on his face, Kakashi said, "Okay then how about you duck but, air." He decided that he was too far beneath the bait, so he just ignored the remark and continued. Once more, Sakura swooned at how dark and broody her Sasuke was. "My name's Sasuke Uchiha. I don't really like or dislike anything, I don't really have a dream, it's more of an ambition, to kill a certain man and resurrect my clan." Kakashi pointed to him and said, "Well then you're up Blondie." Naruto's issue was that he didn't have much time to enjoy much of anything. "My names are Naruto Uzumaki Senju, I like." Even though he didn't necessarily lie when he said, I like my scalpels," it sounded a little flimsy. What a laugh, he had no right to call himself a medic. "I'd rather not comment on the stuff I dislike. As for my dream for the future, well, I guess to follow in my mother's footstep and become a legendary medic." He concluded with an amused expression that Naruto soon realized was amused. "Well then now that that's out of the way we can get down to business. You're to report to Training Area 7 at 6:30 tomorrow for survival training." Naruto thought to himself, have to give him credit, he can be pretty expressive with just one eye. Sakura, who had been eyeing Sasuke up until this moment, piped up, "But sensei, we've already done survival training in the academy?" "Well, it's more of a test to see if you really have what it takes to be a genin than training," replied Kakashi. She practically screamed, "What? But we already passed the genin test, why do we have to take another?" Even Sasuke took a look at that and said, "Oh that was just to weed out the hopeless cases. This test is your real genin test and I'll warn you now it has a 66.6% failure rate." He abruptly put on one of his amused little eye smiles and said, "Anyway, remember training filed 7 at 6:30. Oh, I wouldn't recommend eating breakfast or you're just going to puke anyway. See ya." Then, in a cloud of smoke, he vanished, leaving 3 genin hopefuls on the roof unable to speak. With that, he began to descend the stairs back into the academy. "Well, it looks like we have a full day ahead of us tomorrow, so I think I'm going to head home now, see you guys later." Even though it was late, likely close to 3 in the morning, you could still hear footsteps thundering down one of the village's side streets. Among the thousands of merchants who lived in Konoha, these feet belonged to a Futashi Isanko. His wife and 2 kids lived in relative comfort in his modest home. It was a little small, but what can you do? A short distance from his home, he ran a small connivance store. But lately, business had slowed down, and it had become increasingly difficult to make ends meet. This actually explains why he was running as if his life depended on it, which, incidentally, it does. He had been unable to pay for the heart he had purchased last year due to his financial difficulties. Regretfully, Gene Company had a very rigid payment schedule, and he was aware that pleading for an extension would not help. He didn't waste time looking behind him. Instead, he just ran as hard as he could when he heard a noise behind him. He wished to avoid death. He had to live for his wife and children. He was so preoccupied with the sound of footsteps behind him that he failed to notice the ninja wire hanging across the street until he had already stumbled over it. A rather abrupt kick to the side of the head left him flat on his back before he could even straighten himself. His chest began to feel very heavy, and when he looked up, all he saw was his own death staring back at him. Even though he was only 5 feet tall, the face in front of him was enough to make anyone who had neglected to pay for the new organs dread their dreams. There was no mistaking the Repo Man, who was dressed in oversized rubber aprons, black leather pants, and large black rubber boots and gloves. However, the mask that haunted people's dreams, the ridicule of a surgeon's headgear, and the light that illuminated his eyes were more striking than the clothing. See the profile picture or Google it. He lost all conscious thought at this point as his scalpel's sharp blade sliced through his neck, severing both his windpipe and his jugular artery. The black-clad figure began slicing away at his chest, peeling the skin back, taking hold of his still beating heart, and pulling it out of his chest. He was lying on the ground, trying desperately to gasp in what air he could and stop the bleeding with his hands. Futoshi Asanko's life came to an end with that final act of violence, and his body was dumped in the middle of the road. He stood up and looked around him after securing the organ in a plastic bag and placing it in his specially designed medical bag. At that moment, he became aware of the Anbu squad that was presently observing him from the roof of a building across the street. He gave them a straightforward nod before turning away and moving down the street without even looking back at the men behind him. He avoided getting in the way of the Anbu, who did the same, and everyone left contented, at least in one piece, because it had become an unspoken rule that repo business was just that. He hurried through the wall, which opened as usual, because he didn't want to be seen in this area of town. The darkness of the tunnel leading to his house was all that was visible to him at this point. As he moved slowly down the tunnel, his mind drifted, as it often did, to how he had ended up in this predicament. It had been nearly a year. For what? He spent a year hunting down people, dissecting them, and gutting them like wild animals because he made a mistake and wasn't good enough when it mattered. No, he was aware that he was solely responsible for his current circumstances, and it might have been appropriate. If this was his penalty for his shortcomings, he would just have to accept it. After giving it some last thought, he went into his home's basement, the same one he had used to kill his mother. It wasn't the same, though. What had been nothing more than unused storage had turned into his personal hell. Various operating tables and knives and other medical equipment were hanging from hooks throughout the space, all of which had witnessed the final moments of someone's life. After carefully taking off his coat and putting it on a hook in one of the side rooms, he finished taking off his mask and setting it on a fake head that he had set up on one of the work tables, depicting a boy with deep blue eyes and bright blonde hair. Before slowly ascending the stairs to the main part of the house to get what little sleep he could before Kakashi's test, Naruto complains to himself, "I hate my job." The moon and stars were obscured by clouds, and the only light source visible was the light inside his mask. It was late, long after midnight. He had been waiting for his target to go home for the night for almost an hour. A face was all he needed, so he never really bothered to remember their names, Hitome or otherwise. He now realized that it was somewhat ironic that he was waiting to take those beautiful eyes. The irony actually caused a tiny smile to appear on his face. He had previously questioned whether his work was finally wearing him down, but he immediately dismissed the idea when he noticed someone walking across the street in the direction of the building. He reasoned that the likelihood of this being his girl at this hour of the night was fairly high. As he recalled that the last one had nearly 3 squads of Enbu descend on him, he thought, "God, I hope she's not a screamer." He could tell that some of them chose to stay and observe, but it didn't matter because they quickly backed off after realizing who he was. Fucking bastards, it's not as if he doesn't already have enough stress. An audience was the last thing he needed. It was simple enough to land silently behind the girl. After all, she was merely a civilian. He knew he had the right girl the moment he grabbed her by the shoulder and whirled her around. She let out one of the loudest screams he had ever heard before he could even raise his knife to cut her. Before swiftly cutting her mind and placing her body on the ground, he thought to himself, of course she's a screamer. He detested eye repos because they were extremely difficult to remove undamaged. He hated that cat, and when he suggests amputating one or two legs, everyone freaks out. However, he had to admit that it beat the hell out of finding that damn cat every other day. He could have done it with what he had on him at the time, so it's not like it would have been that difficult. Even though D-rank missions are dull, he gets enough excitement at night, and they were normal, something he needed as much of in his life as possible, so he shouldn't be whining. They finished with a total of 2.5 minutes, which is my personal best, if I may say so. He felt the eyes on his back as he got to his feet, and sure enough, there was a group of Anbu. I could tell they were new guys, and none of the veterans even stopped to look. Without even glancing back at them, he picked up his bag and began to leave, missing the cozy bed that awaited him at home. I'm still not sure how we passed our Genin exam. In fact, the only reason I gave Sakura some food was because her growling stomach would have quickly given us away, and I really didn't want to have to return to the academy. Does he let his thoughts wander now that his work is over? I'll admit that this whole team thing isn't me. Perhaps I've been working in repos for too long, or perhaps I've always been the lone wolf type, but whatever the case, I'll work in teams because it's better than my night job. Oh well, we passed, so it doesn't really matter anymore. Naruto genuinely detested this place. Nothing positive had ever happened here. He had killed his first man, sold his soul, met old Snakeface, and now he wished he could forget the memory. The fact that many people here were well aware of who he was and that this had always left him with a negative impression didn't help either. But since he didn't want his boss to think he had run off, it seemed wise to let him know he wouldn't be in the village for a while. He paused at the desk of the receptionist in front of the big double door leading to the office of Orochimaru's. There had been a long, standing, "Excuse me, I don't suppose His Holiness is free at the moment?" game between the two, he assumed. Orochimaru always regarded everything he said as the highest compliment imaginable, and Naruto never addressed him by his true name. It was simultaneously funny and annoying. However, he declined to be the first to break, and Orochimaru didn't appear to be doing so anytime soon either. The nickname made her laugh a little. "Why, of course, Mr. Senju, you know His Holiness," she said. She pushed a hidden button that opened the double doors in front of him and raised a small eyebrow at the end, saying, "Always has time to talk to one of his employees." He merely rolled his eyes at her vague allusion to his night shift and entered the surprisingly modest office. As modest as the snake could possibly be. Fortunately, none of his kids were present at the time. Though he personally preferred dealing with the snake, he at least knew what to expect from the man, and the three were nearly as dysfunctional as their father. With a broad smile, the snake Sannin said, "Ah, Naruto my boy, it's such a pleasure to see you again. It really has been too long since we've been able to talk face to face like this. But I'm sure this isn't a social call now, is it?" Naruto sat on the couch in front of Snake Sannin's desk and said, "You know me too well. Actually, I just came to inform you that my squad has been given a mission outside of Konoha and so won't be able to collect any outstanding debts in the meantime." He laughed a little at his own joke. "Oh, is it that time already? Off saving damsels in distress and fighting evil missing nin?" All Naruto did was roll his eyes. "Well, I'm sure we'll be able to hold down the fort while you're off saving the world and whatnot, but if you don't mind my asking, just where is it you'll be heading? After all, we have people from all over coming to us and there's always someone missing a payment now, isn't there?" he asked with an earnest grin. Naruto simply moaned. He had been hoping for a little vacation, but now he had to play repo in addition to protecting the elderly man. "We'll be heading to the land of waves, though I wouldn't think that there would be many repossessions needed out that far. It is a rather poor country, not exactly the type of people who opt for elective surgery, if you know what I mean." "Now Naruto, let's not be so hasty. There's no way to know for sure unless we look now, is there?" asked him. "What a waste of a pleasant, straightforward mission." "No, I guess there's not," he replied, aware that there would always be at least a handful. He turned and went to a filing cabinet, rummaged through a few folders, and then stopped, saying, "Well then, let me just check the file." With that evil fucking smile, he said, "Well, what do you know? There are a few outstanding claims in Wave, not too many of courses, but enough to keep you occupied, I'm sure." Naruto remarked, mainly to himself, "And here I was hoping to actually get a few nights of decent sleep." He responded with a mocking little laugh. Sleep is highly overrated, my dear doctor. Besides, you've been doing fine so far. I'm sure a few more nights won't hurt that much. He was becoming desperate and knew it, but he really didn't want to deal with this crap on his first mission. And how, pray tell, am I supposed to keep my little night time excursions from the rest of my team? I'm sure Kakashi is already suspicious, and I doubt he would miss a bunch of bodies missing organs. He'll find me out for sure. Now you're just whining. Besides, I'm sure you'll think of something out, and if not, well, how long did you really think you could hide this little secret of yours? Replied he. Fuck it, he might as well just give up and leave, since there was no way he was going to escape this. He grabbed the folder and left after saying, fine, but really is one little vacation too much to ask for? He still had to pack, but now he had to pack twice as much. He detested his good fortune. A bloody A-rank missing nin with a sword taller than him attracts him to his first C-rank mission. In addition, he had to perform roughly 20 repositionings during his stay here. The unfairness of it all made him want to scream at times. How could he have gotten to where he was? He had always aspired to be a good doctor, help people, and follow in his mother's footsteps. What on earth was the matter with that? But for whatever reason, factual, random, or perhaps his own incapacity, he had been deprived of his dream and exiled from the light to stand by himself outside the house of his first target. It was just a local fisherman who needed a new heart and was about to lose it. After deciding that a direct approach might be the most straightforward, after all, who expects a repo man to knock on the front door? He hurried to the house, thinking that he might be able to knock off another target. In fact, the number of times this worked was rather amusing. After shaking his head to clear it, he lifted his hand and knocked on the door. He didn't have to wait long, because as soon as the door opened, he slashed the old man across the room, pushed him back inside, tore off his old gray shirt, and quickly cut away at the surrounding muscle and flesh until he could easily reach under the rib cage and remove the appropriate organ. After finishing his work, he concluded that he didn't have time to go out and look for any more targets tonight. I'm cursing that snake bastard once more for providing him with so many damn targets and a limited window of opportunity to finish it. He would simply need to demonstrate it to him. Even though he didn't particularly enjoy his job, he was competent at it, and he wouldn't be damned if he allowed that snake bastard to prove it. He hurriedly gathered his belongings and left the body for either the man's family or untamed animals to find. Naruto gradually regained consciousness as dawn broke. He really didn't want to deal with any bothersome questions first thing in the morning, so he had made the decision to sleep outside last night. Abruptly, he became aware that there was another person in the clearing. Fortunately, he still had his mask on, which was the only thing keeping him alive at the moment. Crap, I'm still wearing my business suit. He decided that playing possum was no longer a good idea, so he sat up and looked at the person who had discovered his sleeping form. In an attempt to find the best herbs to hasten his master's recovery, Haku had gone out early. He pretended that it had been 2 weeks even though he had only been in beads for 2 days. He was still amazed at how he could be both a spoiled child in his sick bed and a demon in a fight. But he was not here to ponder the peculiarities of his master's mind. But as he kept looking, he found something that, to be honest, he had never seen before. Not just any repo man, but one who had apparently dozed off in the clearing. He immediately recalled everything he and Zabuza had heard about this specific group of people, which was, to be honest, not much. He had heard that Gene Company was beginning to make progress in the other major shinobi villages, but there wasn't much of a demand for organs outside of Konoha. However, outside of Konoha, a repo man was practically unheard of, and this one appeared to be napping. Probably had a long night. That thought had brought to mind that, since it was their job, a long night for him most likely involved the reposition of several organs. When he looked back, he saw that the person he was studying was sitting upright and staring directly at him, but he had completely lost sight of them in all of his internal monologue. A long awkward pause ensued. Hi, may not be the most refined way to greet someone, but he was never the refined kind. Haku had no idea how to react to that, even for a missing nin who was right up there on the wired. Oh, Meter, you didn't talk to someone who made a living by harvesting body parts every day. Nevertheless, deciding that it might not be the best idea to offend him might not be the best course of action. In addition, all of his body parts were, in a sense, part of the original set, so there is no need to worry about being on his repo list. He really didn't want to sound as uncomfortable as he did when he said, hi? When Naruto eventually stood up and searched for his bag, he thought, this was just plain stupid. He had not anticipated what transpired next, though. In fact, the individual had gotten closer to him. Everyone fled when they saw him like this for the first time. It was better to be safe than sorry. However, he was only a few feet away from this individual. The man in front of him is actually a very androgyn-looking boy. Upon closer inspection, you learn to spot these types of things in his line of work. The only people who had gotten this close to him in his business suit were, for the most part, very dead, so it wasn't the closeness, at least not completely. However, it wasn't because he was looking him in the eyes. No one, not even a gene company, ninja, or one of his victims, had ever done that. Hell, he could barely bear to look into a mirror, and they were his eyes, damn it. Alright, enough was enough. He was becoming genuinely uneasy about this. In the hopes that the boy would take the hint and back off a little, he said, can I help you with something? Haku quickly looked away after realizing he was staring. With what he hoped was a disarming smile, he concluded, no, that's fine, I was just out picking herbs for a friend of mine. Without saying another word, he said, and began searching for his bag. He swiftly picked it up and headed back toward Tsunade's house after finding it not too far from where he had fallen asleep. He would need to change en route, but that wasn't the main issue because the others would be wondering where he had disappeared. But before he could focus on trying to come up with the right excuses, the strange boy in the clearing interrupted him once more. Again, he asked himself, what the devil was he doing? He ought to have remained silent and allowed the man to go. He was equally shocked when the question came out of his mouth because, regrettably, his mouth didn't seem to want to listen to him. He nearly hoped the man would say no and walk away when he asked, can I ask you something? Another first. He was genuinely unsure of how to react as the day became more bizarre and unusual. I guess. He was still trying to make sense of the situation, but it sounded more like a question than a response. Oh my god, Haku was shocked to hear him ask, why do you do what you do? He was certain that this was the question that would most likely result in his death out of all the ones he could have asked. The man cursed himself for not bringing Senbon as he stood there staring at him. He was struck with the question like a ton of bricks. What did he do? What did he do? Because he was skilled at it and because he was a monster? No, he killed the only person who could take care of him, so all those reasons came later. X rewind. X at first, it had been nothing more than a cough. Then the fever struck, but this time it was nothing. She had just needed some rest. However, she continued to get sicker and sicker over time, and no doctor was able to identify the cause. As time passed, she continued to deteriorate, and he devoted himself to his studies in a desperate attempt to find a way to assist her. He believed that he had finally discovered the cure after months of study and investigation. However, he had been mistaken, and his cure had only made her condition worse. As a result, she had passed away in his arms. He had no idea how long he had been sitting on the ground before being discovered by Jinko. Founder Orochimaru, an old teammate of his mother's, he had sold his soul there, on that chilly floor. Promised to take care of him, ensure that no one ever found out that he had killed his mother, and allow him to lead a normal life if he came and worked for him. And he had agreed, like the naive, stupid child he had been. Thus, he became the repo man for Orochimaru's. X finished the flashback. X in a desperate attempt to erase the memories of his past, Naruto shook his head. He swiftly turned around and left the clearing after saying, because I was an idiot. Haku simply stood there in disbelief. He had not, in all honesty, anticipated receiving an answer to his query. At least not one that did not entail his attempting to murder him. But he wasn't rooted to the spot by the response. His eyes were the same as they had been before, filled with pain and speaking of loss in a way that few could comprehend. The man in front of him began to retreat, and he silently prayed that he would soon find his beloved because nobody should have eyes like that. He had his own precious person to look after, so he turned around and left for the forest again after having that thought. He simply couldn't accomplish this. As he gazed down at the paper in his hand, that was the thought that was going through his mind. He seems to be mocked by the picture of him smiling. My goodness, he had never detested his work more than he did now. The word, reposes, is written in bold red beneath the smiling face of a tsunami. Until now, he had never had to kill anyone he knew. All of the people he had killed were merely names and faces, without any family or friends, and weren't actual people. Now that he knew her, he had spoken to her and witnessed her love for her father and son, which was equal to his own love for his mother. He was supposed to just enter the room, cut her open, and then leave her bloody body in the kitchen for Inari to discover the next morning. After all of his talk about heroes and defending those he loved, how in the world was he supposed to do that? He would rather fight Zabuza without a weapon than do that. Fortunately, they had set up camp close by, so even though he was running through the trees back toward the tsunami's house, he should be able to return before anyone wakes up. It had only taken him 2 hours to get there, and now that he was standing in front of the house he had just left, he could already feel his blood run cold knowing what he would have to do. He almost wished that Kakashi had seen him and was coming to stop him, but no one in Konoha would stop him. Even though it was unwritten, the rule that no one interferes with a repo man still applied. He then approached the house slowly and peered through the darkened window to see her washing the dishes from the dinner she had made for them just hours earlier. He was grateful that he had remembered everyone's schedules, which ironically had been done at the time to try to better protect them. He really didn't want Inari to come in on him destroying his mother, so he hoped that he would be asleep. Tazuna would still be at the bar. Deciding that the best course of action would be to approach the door covertly, he silently selected the lock and crept into the dark house, grateful that she was facing away from him and that the only light was in the kitchen. Grumbling that he couldn't just cut her brain, he slowly moved behind her, concluding that this had to be a lung and windpipe job. He was standing behind her before he was even prepared. When he looked into her eyes, all he saw was terror, and he swore that he could feel what was left of his heart shatter. A few hours earlier, they had held such warmth and compassion when she was looking at him at the end of that bridge. His pulse quickened, and before he even realized what was happening, he and the tsunami were on the ground, her flat on her back, him straddling her waist. He was at his breaking point. The looks didn't bother him before, when he could just ignore the fact that the people he had been killing were real, but now they were coming from someone he knew and who he had grown to care about in some small way. He felt like the monster he knew he was when that person looked at him that way. He took his scalpel and cut out her eyes as the first thing that came to mind to stop her from staring at him in that manner. She was screaming bloody murder by this point, but he didn't care anymore and swiftly cut off her shirt and bra. He then made the traditional Y incision, which was 1 long and 2 shorter, and peeled back the skin to reveal the rib cage that protected his target. The screams of tsunamis had now reduced to labored breathing. It took him nearly 3 minutes to cut through the ribs, which he detested, and by then, the tsunami's labored breathing had stopped, and she lay motionless. At last, he received his reward. He stood and looked over his work after placing the lungs and the rest of his equipment in his bag. What have I done, my God? As he glanced down at the blood dripping from his gloves, he asked himself. He heard a sound from his left at that moment. As he turned his head in increasing fear, he saw Inari standing on the bottom step of the stairs, staring at the scene in front of him without blinking. Then he looked at him with fear and seemed to ask why. Why had he destroyed his life, killed his mother, and betrayed him in this way? He had to flee before he caused any more harm because he could not stand it any longer. With that, he ran out the front door and headed back toward the woods, where he had come from. He honestly didn't care how long he had been standing there, and he had no idea. So that he wouldn't have to come close to them, so that he wouldn't feel anything for them, so that he wouldn't care if he ever had to kill them, he even wished that the rest of his team would find him here. A part of him wished they would never find out so he wouldn't have to witness the hateful and disgusted expressions. A part of him also wished for the earth to burst open, engulf him, and remove any proof that he had ever been there. In a fit of self-disgust, he tore off his mask and threw it across the clearing before collapsing to the ground and seeing flashing pictures of all the other people he had murdered. Incapable of ignoring the reality that, like a tsunami, each of them had a family and loved ones, and that, for every one of them, he had destroyed the lives of innumerable others, robbing mothers of their children, husbands of their wives, and children of their parents because they had neglected to make a single payment. He was so upset that he failed to notice the person staring down at him from the trees. He had always known that his blonde student was more than he appeared to be, but he had always thought it was because he was the Kyuubi's container. But as time passed, He began to suspect that his student's strange behavior was caused by more than just the fox. To be honest, though, this was a surprise to him. It was startling to consider that one of the most ambitious medical geniuses of the new generation, the son of his lat sensei, the adopted son of the renowned medic Tsunade, was infecting one of the most feared men in the entire village. The repo man, not his pupil, was crying uncontrollably and, for the first time, he was unsure of what to do. Even though he had never lost anyone to a repossession before, mostly because everyone he had ever cared about had already passed away, he had witnessed the aftermath of those repossessions. In fact, he had watched in morbid fascination the first time he had seen the man at work while on patrol, and he could honestly say that it had shaken him to his core. And now he had a moral choice to make. Would Naruto try to console Sakura or Sasuke if they were standing in front of him? Hell, if he were wearing anything else? He was clearly trying to keep this a secret, and he doubted that even the third knew, but it wasn't just his student on the ground, and that was his problem. But the boy's need for assistance was equally clear. At that point, he made his choice in spite of his students' secret life. He couldn't simply abandon him there because he was still his pupil. He then leapt to the ground and waited for the teenager covered in blood to notice him. Feeling the new presence leap down from the trees, he leapt to his feet. He was frantically wiping the tears from his eyes and looking around the clearing to identify the person who had just shown up. His sensei was quickly spotted standing on the other side of the clearing. No. Was a catastrophe. Given that his gloves were still covered in tsunami blood, he had been caught red-handed. In the vain hope that he could hide behind it and everything would return to normal, he looked around the clearing in despair. Like a cornered animal, he saw his student scan the clearing frantically, and he realized that there was a very real possibility that this could turn violent. He made the decision that he would have to take the lead in getting things started. He was kicking himself as he said, "Well, this is certainly a surprise." But really, what was he supposed to say in such a circumstance? Naruto had finally given up on finding his mask because he had been discovered and there was nothing else he could do. There were then only two choices. He could attempt to murder his sensei, to start. Alternatively, he could assume that his teacher would not tell. Even though he detested having to put his trust in anyone, he knew that his chances of killing Kakashi were slim. So all he could do was hope the man knew how to keep a secret. "I guess it would be. Though you seem to be taking it rather well." He hoped the little joke would lighten the mood a bit, but now that he was on par with the blonde, he had to admit he made a rather terrifying visage. "Well, I've seen a lot in my lifetime, though I'll admit that this definitely makes my top 10 lists." Blood glinting in the moonlight as he paced back and forth in that black suit. In fact, a slight chill went down his spine. He just glared at him more. "Though you could say the same thing about yourself, I would imagine. This is not working," he reflected. "Hell, it appears that I will have gone straight to the source." The blonde stopped pacing and was now just glaring at him, as if that caught his attention. "So busy night, I take it?" It was more than clear what he had been doing, so what in the world was he supposed to say to that? He glanced down at the blood still on his gloves and said, "You could say that." In an attempt to lighten the mood, he asked half-jokingly, "Anyone I know?" But he had not anticipated the blonde to actually start laughing. It was such a terrible laugh that he hoped he would never hear it again. He simply couldn't help himself, it was too much. In between bursts of laughter, he said, "You could say that." When he saw that his bag was only a few feet away, he swiftly closed the distance, picked it up, and opened it. Since the blonde was clearly not present at the moment, Kakashi was on guard. He grabbed his bag and assumed a basic fighting stance. After bringing the two closer until he was just a few feet away from his sensei, Naruto opened the bag and hurled a plastic bag at Kakashi. He caught the plastic bag before he realized what it was, anticipating an attack. Nevertheless, he quickly realized that he was not being attacked. His focus abruptly shifted from Naruto to the bag he was holding. When he realized that the bag contained a set of lungs, he nearly threw it to the ground. "Anyone I know?" the blonde repeated. With a hint of insanity in his voice, the blonde said, "I know you don't recognize her, but allow me to reintroduce you to the person whose house you've been sleeping in for the past 2 weeks." Since that was the last thing he had anticipated, all Kakashi could do was stare down at the plastic bag in disbelief. Seems she needed a new pair a few years ago, and well, with the way Godu was running things, she started to miss payments. And well, I was in town anyway, so old Snakeface decided it was time to collect. It was almost funny that she was on the list. I mean, what are the chances? He said. Now that he had witnessed how well she and Naruto had gotten along, Kakashi was completely lost. The idea that he had just a few hours left before breaking into her home and severing her lungs made his blood run cold. Shocked, horrified perhaps. Come now, sensei, I haven't even finished my story yet, Naruto said, backing away a few feet and beginning to pace once more. You see, I messed up, I didn't kill her quickly enough. She started screaming, not that I cared at that point, and when I was finished I found little Inari just standing there on the stairs looking at me standing over his mother's body. And you know what I did? He inquires in a voice that echoes how he thought. In all honesty, Kakashi had no idea what he was supposed to do, and his mouth was dry. On one side of the clearing, one of his students was still covered in blood and appeared to be completely insane, while he stood in the middle of a clearing in the middle of the night, still holding onto a bag that contained what had once been the host's lungs for the previous 2 weeks. He was rehearsing his speech for their first kills, and he would have done anything to make it as easy as that. No guesses. Well, no need to worry, he's fine. Well, he's alive at any rate. Though it probably would have been kinder to simply kill him there instead of having to live with those memories. In fact, I could probably get there and back in time if I pushed it. What do you think, sensei? He asked with a wide grin. All vestiges of S vanished. When he started this job, no one ever informed him that he would be dealing with psychotic genin. You don't really want to do that, Naruto. He turned to the moon and said, don't I? Why not? What's one more person? Naruto concluded, still gazing up at the moon, saying, I have the blood of hundreds on my hands. What difference would one more make? Or 2, or 3, or 5, or 10, or 20. It's all the same in the end. It was nearly physically painful to see the train wreck of a genin in front of him, and all he could do was hope he could calm him down. Naruto, listen to yourself. You don't really think that. He cursed his incompetence, saying, you're not a monster, Naruto. You're just confused. You just need to calm down. He was never very good at this kind of thing. Naruto glanced down at Kakashi's hands after turning back to him, after saying, you're right, I don't. He glared at Kakashi. But you were wrong too. I am a monster. I'm worse than the Kyuubi. He's a force of nature. He kills because that's what he supposes to do. But me, I chose to become this. I finally see the truth. And you know what, sensei? He returned the glare to Kakashi. Uncertain of where this was going, Kakashi swallowed hard, but he remained hopeful as he heard his student's insanity slowly fade. Since he was certain that witnessing one of his genin self-destruct was one of the most stressful experiences he had ever had, he prayed that this would end quickly. What? He inquired, unsure if he would like the response. He picked up his mask and bag after saying, I just can't seem to bring myself to care anymore. However, not before he passed a frozen Kakashi and grabbed the plastic bag that held the Tsunade's lungs. He kept walking, but before he left the clearing, he turned back to Kakashi once more. You know what, sensei? I think that this little talk of ours was just what I needed. I felt much better now. He said, oh, and by the way, I would really appreciate if this stayed between just you and me. And then he disappeared into the night, walking into the darkened woods. Gods, why in the world had he said all those things, and what was wrong with him? He wasn't a monster, he didn't really believe it, and he cared. Oh, how he cared, even though he knew what he was doing was bad, immoral, and even evil. He didn't enjoy his work or take pleasure in murdering people, but that didn't mean he was a bad person. He was not, in fact, a monster. But even as he was thinking this, a voice in the back of his mind told him that he was deceiving himself into believing that everything he had said in that clearing had been true. No, it was just the stress talking. That wasn't me. The voice mocked him, telling him that he was deluding himself, asking him what he considered normal, and saying that he would be much happier if he simply let go and accepted who he was. I just need to calm down, everything will be fine. All I need is a vacation and everything will go back to normal. He had broken down in the woods a week prior. Fortunately, Kakashi had granted them some time off, ostensibly to allow them to recover from finishing a mission of such importance. However, Naruto was aware of the true cause. Kakashi was worried, rightly so, that if he was under any more stress, he would break like a brittle, dry twig. Even Orochimaru had recognized that he needed a respite and had granted him some time off, in an attempt to persuade himself that he was not that individual back in the clearing. Naruto ended up atop the Hokage monument. With his knees pressed to his chest, he found himself leaning against a tree and watching the sun set over the village, desperately trying to reassure himself that everything would be alright. Hinata entered the scene at this point. She had always admired the blonde's kindness, his constant happiness, his self-assurance, and the fact that he had maintained an air of silent confidence even after his mother passed away. She had even more respect for him because of his fortitude and will to pursue his goals despite losing his only family. And over the past year, Hinata's admiration for the blonde had only increased to the point where she felt comfortable confessing to herself that she had fallen in love. She therefore felt pain in her heart when she saw him sitting there with his knees pressed to his chest and a distressed expression on his face. She became even more in love with him after realizing that, despite his public displays of confidence, he was just a person like her who experienced loss and pain like everyone else. But no, she was in a difficult situation. It was clear that the boy in front of her was in pain, and if she had been more courageous, she would have tried to console him. All she could do was stand there, helpless, and desperately trying to muster all the courage she had left in her tiny body because her feet would not listen to her. With pictures of everyone he had slain flashing before his eyes, the sound of his knife slicing flesh, and the sensation of ripping a living person's heart from their chest, Naruto was engrossed in his own little world. The sounds of his knife slicing flesh, the sensation of ripping someone's still beating heart from their chest, and the voice in the back of his mind telling him that was who he was, what he was meant to do, that those were not the actions of a good person, and that he was a monster that he secretly knew he liked it. Naruto's only option was to sob while holding his knees even closer to his chest and letting out a desperate cry. Hearing the anguish in that cry was enough for her to stop standing there. Gathering all her courage, she emerged from her hiding place and cautiously made her way to the person she most admired. When Naruto realized he was no longer alone, he was abruptly brought back to reality. He leapt to his feet, but when he turned around, he realized it wasn't Kakashi as he had thought. The girl he remembered from the academy, Hinata if he recalled correctly, was standing in front of him instead of the tall, gray-haired man who was silver, if you asked him. Hinata pursed her fingers and said, "Anyo. I'm sorry for disturbing you. I'm not typing stuttering, so just assume she is." She was staring at the ground. This was a terrible idea. He probably came up here to be by himself, she reflected. She paused there, wondering what she had planned to do. "It's just that you sounded so sad and I..." In a nearly whispery voice, she concluded, "I just wanted to help maybe." Naruto simply gave an owlish blink, indicating her desire to assist him. She was aware of his identity, his nighttime activities, and the fact that he had no support. She didn't, of course. He could count on one hand the number of people who were aware of his true identity. He turned away from the girl and began to leave after saying, "You shouldn't bother, some people are beyond helping." Hinata was astounded to learn that one of the nicest people she had ever met was claiming to be unable to help. She practically shouted, "That's not true, no one's beyond helping." To their surprise, "Anyo." "But it's true," she said, reverting to her bashful personality. "I don't know why you're upset, but I know that you're one of the kindest people I know, and if anyone deserves help it's you." Oh, she wouldn't be saying those things if she knew who he was, what he had done, and what he planned to do. He started to leave after saying, "You don't know what you're talking about." She practically whispered to herself, "Maybe, but I still want to help." She didn't know what she was talking about, so why was he doing this? You don't make a monster feel better, but to her, at least, he wasn't. His response was right there. The Repo Man was a monster, but that was only a portion of him. He wasn't. To the others, he was simply Naruto. That was his response. He simply needed to consider the two as two distinct identities. He was Naruto when he was Naruto and the Repo Man when he was the Repo Man. They were two entirely different individuals. Naruto turned to face the bashful girl behind him. After saying, "Hinata, thanks for caring," he approached her and gave her a hug. He looked down and saw that the girl had passed out in his arms. "Have no idea just how much you helped me out there, Hinata?" he asked. He just scowled in perplexity, set the girl down, and sat her against a tree. And backed up, gave her one last perplexed glance, shook his head in mild perplexity, and turned to leave, but not before saying, "Thank you," once more in silence. He was better than ever when he returned. Here, in the complete darkness of the night, sitting on the rooftops like a gigantic bird of prey, he felt better than he had in the entire week. He was free to do as he pleased, to relish the excitement of the hunt, to revel in the fear of his victims, and to finally be who he had always known he was, no longer constrained by his worthless moral sense. The monster that had always been a part of him was free to be himself. Finally letting go and being himself felt good. He wanted to laugh at himself for being so foolish as to not realize this sooner. The repo man didn't even understand what those words meant, so it was ideal. He no longer had to question whether what he was doing was right or wrong. The important thing to remember is that he was the repo man, not Naruto. They were two entirely different individuals. He lacked the compassion that Naruto possessed. Despite having a strong sense of right and wrong, Naruto lacked it. Being a great doctor was Naruto's dream, but his only thought was about who he would attack next. Despite having the same body, they were two entirely different individuals. Well, not quite, but sufficiently. And to think that shy girl back on the monument was the reason for all of this. Without her, he might have taken a lot longer to reach the same conclusion. Since girls like flour, he would have to do her something nice, like get her some flour. It wasn't time to think about that, he said, shaking his head. He had a task to complete, and it appeared that his next victim was going to enter his web. In all honesty, he had to wonder why anyone would wander the dimly lit streets of Konoha knowing that a repo man would be searching for them. However, he dismissed it because it ultimately made his job easier and he was ready to wait for the Oblivion Man to fall into his trap. Sato was intoxicated. He was aware that he needed to have a clear head in order to have any chance of surviving, so he knew that now was not the time to drink. Even though he was aware of all these facts, the alcohol was still the only thing preventing him from collapsing. Thus, he ended up staggering back to his home through the streets of Konoha. But in his inebriated daze, he failed to notice the faint shimmer of the ninja wire on the floor. He was therefore caught completely off guard when the wire wrapped around his left foot and pulled him up into the air, causing him to hang upside down from one of the broken light posts with a loud twang. As Naruto leapt from his perch and landed in front of the upside-down man, he thought, too easy. The man was screaming uncontrollably by this point, but Naruto was happy to just let him go. He took out one of his scalpels and started slicing away at the man's midsection, removing fat and skill. Even after the blood from the now widening hole in his torso started to pour down his face, the man continued to scream. But the screaming eventually stopped, and a short while later, there was the sound of knives slicing through flesh. For the first time, Naruto was free of self-loathing and guilt as he stood in the middle of the street, holding a scalpel in one hand and a still, warm liver in the other. He is filled with a wonderful feeling of contentment and joy, so there is no room for anything like that. He felt fantastic and alive. He wanted nothing more than to laugh, and he was going to do just that. And with that, he began to laugh. Not the dark, evil laugh from back in the clearing, but a happy, contented laugh. As he hastily packed his belongings and began to return to the Gene Company building to finish the night's work, he thought to himself, that felt good. They were waiting for their habitually late sensei in their usual spot. They were expecting him at any moment because it had already been 3 hours. Sakura nearby was pining for the final Uchiha while Sasuke, as usual, was leaning against one of the posts. Then there was Naruto, leaning against a tree and sound asleep once more. Kakashi had grown accustomed to that scene from his squad. But it was only now that he realized why the mysterious blonde was constantly dozing off. He had seen something back in Wave, and it was definitely not his student, so to be honest, he still didn't feel completely at ease around him. And that added to the difficulty of what he was about to do. He would never have thought of entering any other team in the Chunin exams because, while each member may have been strong in their own right, they lacked unity as a team. Not to mention that both of the boys on his team were, to put it mildly, mentally unstable in one way or another. However, this was no ordinary team. With regard to Sasuke and showcasing him to the other villages, he had the whole council on edge. On his case concerning Sakura, he then had Orochimaru and Jinko. Her contract said that she would become their full-time spokesperson once she became Chunin. Then Naruto appeared. Along with personally pleading with him to let Naruto in, the head of the Shinobi Hospital mentioned that he had to be at least Chunin in order to work there. Orochimaru himself had also written to him asking Naruto to take part. He wasn't sure if it mattered if he made Chunin or not, but he knew the man there had to be a reason. Overall, he had one of the most powerful men, the hospital staff, and the entire Shinobi Council breathing down his neck. Even though he detested it, he wasn't suicidal enough to kill them all. All he had to do was glance at the sleeping blonde to realize how vicious these people could be. He could only hope they didn't murder one another. With that last thought, he leapt to the ground to introduce his team's nominees. It was that easy. The bastard was dead. His fate was predetermined. All he had to do was cause him to bleed. Even though he had only spoken to the girl once since graduating, he made a self-promise to hold her accountable because she had assisted him, even if she was unaware of it. He had to use all of his self-control to avoid jumping down there and severing his eyes. Wearing full repo gear, he was pacing back and forth in his operating room basement while gazing down at his most recent job. It's not just another merchant, though. He was down here instead of up in the streets because this one was almost entirely composed of Jinko organs. Reaching the nearest work table, he took the man's file. The man who was gagged said, "Well, seems like we're going to be busy tonight, huh?" The man's thrashing against his restraints and muffled screams were the only responses. Naruto laughed at his own small joke and remarked, Now, there's no need to be rude." Before he made his first cut, he said, "Well then, what say we get this party started?" Before long, he was working automatically, letting his thoughts return to the tests he had recently completed. Well, the first 2 parts. The third wasn't due for another month. He may have realized that he was supposed to cheat, but he would confess that he had never been the covert type and lacked the necessary skills to assist him. Fortunately, he was successful in bluffing his way through. They had been ambushed by some rain nin on the 3rd day. The second part had been interesting but not particularly challenging overall. Let's just say that there are 3 less rain nins out there now. Although he delivered the final blow, even Sakura had managed to take one down. Fortunately, they had an earth scroll, which allowed them to enter the preliminary round with little difficulty. But all of the action took place there. Kiba versus a girl with 2 buns in her hair was the first match. Since nobody wants to offend that family, she attempted to throw the match like any other sane person would, but Kiba was not having any of it and insisted that she fight him. Everyone knew it was a lose situation. In reality, the match was fairly close, but Kiba eventually got close enough to demonstrate his skill with a knife to everyone. It was impressive, but not nearly as good as him. It had been fairly uneventful after that. While Tenten was being paired with Orochimaru's adopted daughter Ino, Sakura was placed in the same position. Fortunately, Ino was more than content to accept the simple victory. He had been pitted against an unidentified sand nin. Not that it was a fair fight in the first place. He wasn't a repo man for nothing, but even though she had fought hard, it wasn't enough to stop him. It took Sasuke less than a minute to flatten some pushover. However, the last altercation was what had infuriated him. Hyuga Hinata versus Hyuga Neji. He couldn't hold something like that against him because they were shinobi, not because he had physically assaulted her. Not to mention all the talk of destiny and fate, he was aware of the potential effectiveness of psychological warfare. No, but the girl who had rescued him from the pit of despair he had been in had been the target of a murderous attempt by the bastard. Hyuga Neji was going to die as a result. But now that he considered it, he was related to Hinata, and she might not like that he killed off her family members. He would have to ask her, but he was still going to kick his ass and show Hinata why he was one of the most feared men in the village if she so desired. Lines of light were cast across the bed and against the distant wall as the sun shone through the blinds. Her whole body ached, and all she wanted was to return to the blissful tranquility of sleep. She didn't want to wake up, but she knew it was useless because once she was awake, she could never sleep again. She opened her eyes slowly to discover that she was in one of the Konoha Shinobi Hospital's excessively white rooms. She looked around and saw that it was almost noon when she looked at the wall clock. How long had she been out, she wondered absently. At that moment, a head with wild blonde hair emerged from the door. It would have been an understatement to say Hinata was taken aback by his appearance. He exclaimed, "Oh, you're up," with a tone of surprise. As he entered the room and shut the door, he remarked, "That's great." He gave her one of his few sincere smiles and said, I just stopped by to leave you a get. Well, soon card because I was told you wouldn't be up for at least a few more hours. However, since you're awake anyhow, I'll just give it to you directly. Hinata was at a loss for what to do, and since it was consuming all of her energy to avoid fainting, she did the only thing that came to mind. Anyo. You didn't have to do that. She just thanked him, hating that she couldn't stop stuttering. He placed the card on her bedside table and said, "Of course I did. You a friend and this was the least I could do." He referred to her as a friend, and no matter how many times she said it, it still sounded like a dream. She was going to pass out, and she never would have imagined that he would just come out and say those words. Actually, I wanted to speak with you for another reason. Neji is your relative, correct? With a hint of aggression in his voice, he asked. Hinata didn't understand why he was inquiring about her cousin, but the fact that she was talking to her Naruto at this point made it irrelevant to her. Yes, he's my cousin. Naruto simply nodded his head and said, I'm fighting him in the finales. His voice was a little heated. The idea that the two of them would be fighting made Hinata very uncomfortable. He may despise her, but he was still her cousin, and she still loved him like a big brother even after their match. I bring this up because I'm curious about your thoughts on him. After your most recent game, that is. Well, I could if you'd like. In other words, if you wanted me to, I could teach him a lesson. He was reluctant to ask her directly if she wanted him to kill her cousin for her. Hinata, who was at a loss for words, decided that maybe if he didn't hurt him too much, it would be okay. She nodded her head slowly, but she quickly added, just don't hurt him too much. He was her crush, offering to get revenge. This was something she had only dreamed could have happened. Naruto simply nodded and gave her the thumbs up, saying, whatever you say, Hinata. Chan. Anyway, I have to be going, but I hope you get better in time for the finals. He smiled and turned to leave the room. Not only did Naruto consider them friends, but he also offered to exact revenge on her, which was nearly enough to make Hinata faint. When he called her, Hinata. Chan, her mind finally gave out, and she passed out right away with what could only be described as a perverted smile on her face. It was raining, not that he minded. It had been a week since the end of the exams and he was still waiting to hear back from them. But he had no time to wonder about the results. He was hunting and he had just sighted his prey. She was beautiful, he could admit that. Long legs, heart-shaped face, brown eyes, just the right body type to make men look twice. But that wasn't what he had his sights set on. No, for under those perfectly shaped breasts beat a heart that no longer belonged to her, a heart that he was going to cut out. Silently he stalked her, closing the distance until he was right behind her. Reaching out, he grabbed her head in both hands and quickly snapped her neck before she could even realize what was happening. By now this had become routine. He could dissect a person blindfolded if he had to, and so let his mind wander back to the finals. He and Neji had been up first. Bastard didn't realize just how lucky he was that he talked to Hinata before their fight, or he could honestly say that he would have killed him, and it wouldn't have been a nice death either. He knew the human body inside on out and as such knew some pretty fucked up ways of dying. After him had been Kiba against Shino. Again Shino did the same thing and tried to forfeit, and again Kiba was having none of that. Thankfully for the bug boy, the ref had called the match before there had been too much damage done. After that it had been Ino against Shikimaru. He hadn't even bothered go down to the arena, and again Ino seemed happy with the easy win. Finally it was Sasuke's turn. He ended up fighting one of the genin from grass. It had been close. Grass nin were known for using poisons, but Sasuke was able to eke out a win anyway. The second round was interesting. First was him versus Kiba, and he knew that although Kiba would probably complain, Orochimaru wasn't going to kill off his best repo man just because he roughed up his son a bit. Kiba was strong, he would give him that, but he was a brawler. It had been simple to avoid him, and though he had gotten cut up a bit, he had still been the clear winner. Ino had simply forfeited her match against Sasuke. She, along with half the female population, was gunning for his heart and had no desire to jeopardize that on something like this. And so it came down to the two of them. It had been by far the best fight in the entire exam. Sasuke was fast and with his Sharingan bloody hard to hit. But he was fast too, and he knew the human body better than anyone. He knew how to read people's movement, almost like having his own Sharingan. In the end he had come out on top, but only just. And there, of all the organs, this one was by far his favorite. quickly putting it in a plastic bag, and then in the cooler section of his medical bag he stood up and started to walk toward his home. It was late and he would deliver the heart to Jean Company tomorrow. And from one of the shadowy side streets came the words, "Well, you seem to be doing better. Thank you for noticing, Sensei." "And yes, I do feel much better," Naruto shot back, grinning. With a bored tone, he said, "I'm glad to hear it, you had me a little worried back there." With a tone of mocking condescendence, Naruto said, "Yes, I really should apologize for that, you caught me on a rather bad night, I'm afraid. I was able to tell. Even so, I was sent to inform you that the Hokage wants to see you in the morning." If Naruto hadn't known any better, he could have sworn he heard his foolish smile. "I understand. Do you mean the Repo Man or the genin by me?" In the hopes that it would be the latter, Naruto inquired. "Why would the genin want to speak with a Repo Man, of course?" Kakashi inquired, his laughter clearly audible. Naruto gave him the stink eye and remarked, "You know you're not nearly as funny as you think you are." "Oh, I'm not aware of that. Many people have said that I have a great sense of humor. Have you ever considered the possibility that you're weak in that area?" His tone was rather arrogant as he asked. Naruto said, "I really don't like you sometimes," and turned to leave. Naruto arrived at the cage tower early the following morning, but it appeared that he was not the only one who had received an invitation. He was standing in the lobby with Sasuke and Kiba, who were both trying to ignore each other while standing on a corner. Kiba was sitting in one of the benches with his feet up, but when Naruto entered, he gave him a death glare. This was clearly related to the Chunin exams, and since they were the only people present, it was likely that they had passed. After determining that some sort of calibration was necessary, he looked at the two other new Chunin and concluded that it would probably be best to not even ask them if they wanted to join him. As it turned out, he was correct and all three of them had become Chunin. Hinata was still stiff and out of shape, but it had been improving, so it was not surprising that she didn't notice the person sneaking up on her. She had been up early training, trying to make up for the time she had lost in the hospital, and all she saw was a blob of orange and yellow. "You know what, hey Hinata-chan?" she asked the blob, who she soon recognized as Naruto. To her astonishment, all she could say was, "What?" The blonde nodded to himself and said, "I just made Chunin and I've decided that this calls for a celebration. Come on, let's go get something to eat." The blonde then grabbed the girl's hand and began dragging her into the village. He honestly couldn't recall a time when he hadn't been covered in other people's blood. He knew that there had been a time, but it seemed so far away, so long ago, that it felt more like a dream now. He did remember his mother, though, how she had found him on the street, taken him in, and how she had loved and cared for him, and how he had killed her. The image of her fainting, bleeding out, and dying was still very clear to him, and all he could do was cry and plead with her not to abandon him. No, he couldn't do this now, that had been years ago, he was over it, he had moved on. He had to stop living in the past, he had a life now. It wasn't perfect, but it was his and he was doing the best he could. He had just been named the head surgeon at the hospital. At 18 he was youngest on record by almost 6 years. He was celebrated as the greatest medical genius, surpassing even his own mother, the legendary Tsunade. And on top of that he had been dating the love of his life for the past 3 years. Just the thought of her smiling face was all he needed to get him through the day. But still there was this monster casting its shadow over his happy life. Being a repo man hadn't bothered him for many years, it had become second nature to him by now, but he had no delusions as to what would happen if the world found out. He would be dismissed from his job at the hospital. After all, what kind of doctor goes around killing the people that he had sworn to heal? And what would Hinata think? Would she call him a monster? Would she leave him? He didn't know, and he had no intention of ever finding out. He didn't know what he would do if he had ever lost her. She had become his anchor to reality, something normal he could cling to. Just thinking about her made the small box in his packet feel all the heavier. It had been there for almost a month. He had tried to ask her on more than one occasion, but the word would never leave his mouth. He loved her too much to ask her to marry him. How could he, not while he was still a repo man? It wouldn't be fair to ask that of her. Of course the answer was obvious to the uninformed. He could just quit the repo game, and it wasn't like he needed the money. But it wasn't that easy. He had been doing this for over 7 years now. It was a part of who he was good at it. He even found himself enjoying it from time to time. He didn't know if he could even give it up even if he wanted to. Not to mention the little fact that Orochimaru would not take his retirement very well, he wouldn't put it past the snake to make him disappear. But these were a problem for another time. He was still a repo man and he had a job to do. It had almost become too easy. Time and again he would find his targets just walking the streets. They had to know that he was coming after them. You don't just forget something as important as if you had paid your bill that month. But still they walked out in the open, and they were always surprised when he showed up. Not that he really cared, but he still had to wonder at the collective intelligence of the civilians. It wasn't even like it was just Konoha either. Over the years Jinko had grown by leaps and bounds, and now there were Jinko offices in every major village in the world. And of course, as Jinko grew, so too did Repo, and as his senior Repo man it had been his job to train the new batch of Repo men. At the end of that little project he had turned out almost 20 new Repo men. He had also come to the conclusion that he hated teaching and had to wonder just how Kakashi had done it. He was getting distracted again. He shook his head, he had gotten distracted again. There was a spinal column down there that had his, well, Jinko's name on it, and it wasn't just going to cut itself out. So as quietly as he could he ran up behind the man and slammed his head into the wall of an adjacent building, knocking the man unconscious. From there it was simple to peel the skin and muscle from around the man's spine. The hard part was cutting the spine from the base of the head and the hips, but this wasn't his first and he had already done this procedure that it only took him a few minutes. Finished, he packed up and walked off in the direction of his house. He was having lunch with Hinata and wanted to get a few hours sleep before. It had been another long day. 3 surgeries in a row, and at times he felt like the director and Orochimaru were planning to see how little sleep he could manage. But that wasn't the worst of it. Rather than going home to try to get a few hours of sleep, he was being made to attend a benefit dinner that the hospital was hosting, which at least would make Hinata happy. It had been a long time since she had had a chance to dress up. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't even notice the person in front of him until they were both on the ground, and he muttered, "Sorry." "It's okay, Naruto. In addition, it's been a long time, and I wanted to see you anyhow." She laughed, but this wasn't exactly what I had in mind when I had planned on running into you. She wasn't lying. It had been almost 2 months since they had last talked. He and Sakura had actually become rather close friends. It had been hard at first. His free time was at a premium between the hospital and his night job, but they had somehow made it work, often having lunch together, along with Hinata sometimes. However, as time went on, both had gotten more and more caught up in their work. He had gotten more and more involved with his work at the hospital. And she, after making Chunin, had become Jinko's full-time spokesperson as well as becoming one of the greatest singers in the village, found her own free time diminishing. But still they had been able to meet every now and again and had stayed friends. Not that it was that surprising. Sasuke had disappeared into the unnamed ranks of Anbu some years ago, not that he was ever really up for making friends. Then there was Kakashi. He still didn't know how they had convinced him to become Hokage, though knowing him they either bribed him with copious amounts of smut or they had blackmailed him into it. In any case, they had never really gotten on that well, so he didn't really mind not seeing him all that often. "It has been a while, hasn't it?" He rubbed the back of his neck and asked sheepishly. "Yes, it has, but don't worry, we're both busy people, and besides I imagine I'll be seeing you at the party tonight. After all, the hospital's holding it and you were their golden boy after all." Sakura laughed a little at the nickname, but she couldn't help but shake her head at her former teammate, who was one of the strangest people she had ever met. Perhaps not as strange as Orochimaru and his children, but that wasn't exactly saying much. "Are you planning to attend? No one bothered to tell me, so I doubt you know what the whole thing is about." Since she was the face of Jean Company, he wasn't overly shocked that she was leaving. "Naturally, this whole situation is related to a new painkiller or something, but I'm not positive. However, whatever this new medication is, it's manufactured by Jean Company, so it's my responsibility to introduce it to everyone," she shrugged. It was actually a little strange that he hadn't heard about this. He spent enough time around the building. "Well, that's news to me. It's a little odd to be holding a party just for a new drug, but whatever, and it will give Hinata a chance to dress up so she'll be happy. Anyways, I just wanted to see if you were going to be there. It would have really sucked if I had been stuck alone in a room full of people I didn't know," she said with a broad grin. Aha, don't worry, me and Hinata will be there to save you from all the perverted old men, he chuckled. Sakura simply shook her head, saying, Naruto, you truly are a strange one. In any case, I have to leave, but I'll see you tonight. She then waved goodbye to him and passed him. Turning, he said, Aha, see you tonight. Unfortunately, this was a formal event, so scrubs were not an option, and he didn't think his repo suit was particularly formal either. Naruto had forgotten how much he had detested getting dressed up, and the only two suits he felt comfortable in were his hospital scrubs and his repo suit. Frustrated, Hinata said, Stop fussing. All right. However, he complained, you know how much I detest having to wear this monkey suit. Really, it's not that bad, and besides you only have to wear it for a few hours, and if you behave yourself I might even help you out of it, if you know what I mean, she said, shaking her head at her boyfriend even after all these years. She smiled slyly as she spoke. It had taken her several months to simply stop stuttering in his presence, but after a while she opened up, and the rest was history. He stopped fidgeting with the Western style suit after that. Well, with incentive like that I think I can be convinced to behave for a few hours, but you know I'm going to be a bundle of pent-up energy when we get home. He grinned cockily. As they continued to walk down the street in the direction of the hospital, Hinata simply laughed it off and took hold of his arm. Contrary to popular belief, Naruto had never been particularly gregarious in large groups. In fact, his social skills had only gotten worse over time as he had grown used to spending most of his time alone. He also spent nearly half of his time working as a repo man, and they weren't exactly known for their ability to interact with others. At least he wasn't the focus of attention here, and he still had Hinata by his side. No, that honor belongs to someone else. Orochimaru rarely made public appearances, but since this was his first time using the drug, it was only natural for him to be present. Regretfully, it also meant that his children were present. In one corner, Kiba was pounding on anything that had two legs and the appropriate reproductive organs. Ino was off to the side, probably discussing her most recent surgery with several other girls. Then came Kabuto, who was by far the most bizarre of them all. His face had turned horribly frightened somewhere along the line, but that was nothing in comparison to how he had fixed the issue. He went around stealing women, stretching them over his own, and attaching them with clips he had surgically installed, rather than having standard plastic surgery like most people. Furthermore, he was by far the most conceited person he had ever encountered, as evidenced by the fact that he was now alone in a corner, merely gazing at himself in a mirror. They had an unwritten agreement that said, "Don't mess with me, I don't mess with you," but he didn't really care about them. Even they were aware that their father would not be pleased if he lost his head repo man, which was helpful. But as the light faded and a spotlight filled the stage, his thoughts were abruptly interrupted. Sakura was apparently awake. Even though he wasn't particularly fond of opera, he had to concede that Sakura was a truly remarkable vocalist. It was nearly nightfall. It turned out that the entire evening's events had been about a new medication called Z-Hydrate. He was aware that anything made by Orochimaru should not be taken at face value, even though it had appeared promising. Nevertheless, the evening had been nearly pleasant. He had the opportunity to catch up with Sakura and spend some much-needed quality time with Hinata. He wasn't shocked to see that the Orochimaru was now heading straight for him, though, because he knew his luck couldn't last. He was aware that this would not be pleasant, and he was unable to even act normally because Hinata was standing next to him. With a hint of amusement in his sickeningly smooth voice, he said, "Ah, Naruto my boy, it's so good to see you again. I was almost afraid that you'd be too busy to make it. After all, the way I hear it, you always seem to be busy doing one thing or another." God, he had never been more enraged by the man and his games than he was at the moment. Nearly 2 years ago, Orochimaru offered him a job at Gene Company as one of his lead doctors. "It's good to see you as well. What's it been, almost 2 years now?" Naruto had graciously declined. It had been their final public conversation. As his lead repo man, it goes without saying that they had at least one conversation per month. And as for being busy, well, what can I say? Every time I find myself with some free time, something else always seems to pop up. Yes, I know how it can be. I seem to be finding myself with less and less time to myself. But enough about me. Now why don't you introduce this lovely lady on your arm? With an evil glint in his eye. Naturally, Naruto would bring Hinata into this fucking snake, he thought with a groan. He thought, let's see how you handle that, you snake-faced bastard. Oh, how rude of me. Orochimaru, this is my date Hinata Hyuga. Hinata was on the same squad as my mother, and in fact, he's probably the closest thing I have to family now. Orochimaru merely chuckled softly. He almost sounded sincere when he said, yes, I guess that's true. In fact, I've always thought of you as my favorite nephew. However, Naruto had known the man long enough to recognize when he was merely having fun. Saying, but how rude of me to ignore such a beauty, he took Hinata's hand and gave her a quick peck on the back. As he let go of her hand, he remarked, it's a pleasure to meet you, and might I say it's about time my little Naruto-kun found someone. He faced Naruto once more. You're a very lucky boy, Naruto. A girl like this only comes along once in a lifetime. You'd best hold on to her before someone else sets their eyes on her. He laughed at his own covert threat. Unconsciously, Naruto tightened his grip on Hinata. They're welcome to try, but I'm hardly a pushover. He was aware that their little game was losing. When the game was over and he was declared the winner, he smiled and said, of course, of course. I would expect nothing less concerning someone as beautiful as her. He said, but even though this had been a lot of fun, I really must be leaving. But before I do, I just wanted to let you know that my offer still stands. After all, Gene Company is always looking for people with talents like yours. He then said goodbye to them and disappeared into the crowd. Naruto's thoughts returned to reality when Hinata said, I didn't know you were so close with him. Hinata simply nodded her head in agreement as she said, I don't know if I would say that we were close per se. But I have known him for some time and as such just know how to talk to him. Now I believe that you promised to help me get out of this stupid suit if I behaved, and as far as I can tell I conducted myself as a perfect gentleman, so? He asked with an innocent expression. Did I? I don't seem to remember saying anything like that. Are you sure you didn't just imagine it? She innocently asked. He took her arm and began running home with Hinata at his heels, saying, oh no you don't, you're not getting out of it that easily. He detested the complexity of this situation. It should have been as easy as that. He loved her, and she loved him. He wanted to marry her, settle down, and have children. He wanted to be with her forever. It wasn't fair to ask her to marry him when she wasn't even aware of that aspect of him, aside from the fact that he would never be able to hide his other life from her. If he quit, that's the only way he could ask her, and that thought only made matters worse. The first was that he was aware that Orochimaru would not be happy about losing his best repo man. In addition, there was a part of him that just didn't want to stop, and if he was being completely honest with himself, he wasn't even positive that he could stop if he so desired. He had been a repo man for a longer time than he had been a doctor and ninja. It was ingrained in his identity, and he didn't believe he could simply give it up, not even for Hinata. He was simply bewildered. The list of people he could consult for advice was, predictably, small. Orochimaru was out for obvious reasons, and since only Kakashi knew his secret, he was reluctant to confide in the man about his issues. He doubted that he would be of much assistance, but he could always ask the person he was stalking. He would simply need to figure this out on his own. But he had work to do until then. Before the man even realized what was happening, he stabbed him in the base of the skull because he didn't want to listen to his cries. He simply cut off all of the skin and muscle surrounding the man's stomach after placing him on the ground. There was nothing more to be done because he was only there to treat his large intestines. Then, still unable to come up with a solution, he packed up and headed back to the Gene Company building. But he had to move quickly so Hinata wouldn't wake up and discover he wasn't there. Fortunately for him, she slept a lot and had not yet woken up to discover him gone, but given his luck, it would eventually happen. A week had passed since the hospital party, and Naruto and Hinata were having lunch together at a little eatery close to the hospital. He was still undecided about his course of action. He was unable to make a decision in either direction. It was as if he were engaged in an endless internal conflict, with the repo man on one side and the Naruto who genuinely loved Hinata on the other. But at the moment, he was thinking about the strange behavior of the girl seated across from him. She appeared paler for some reason, and she had also gone back to being the bashful girl she had been when they first became friends. Although he was unsure of the exact issue, he was certain that something was amiss. Hinata, is something bothering you? You know you can tell me anything. He was a hypocrite. She pocked her fingers together as she used to do as a child and stared down at her food, saying, Anyo, it's nothing. Since she hadn't done that in years, Naruto realized something wasn't right. Running through a mental list of possible reasons, he realized that the only one that could cause her to revert to the anxious young woman he had met all those years ago was that she had discovered his secret. The only explanation for the sudden chill that gripped Naruto's heart was that she was afraid of him. No, that was not feasible. He had taken precautions. Something else must be at play. Despite this, he was unable to sense a cold, sweet break. "I know something's bothering you. I'm sure you'd feel better if you told me." His voice was shaking uncontrollably, and it was all he could do to form the words. Hinata was staring down at her food with great attention, and she was pressing her fingers together so firmly that it was surprising they hadn't broken yet. "Anyo. It's just... that I think I might be pregnant." Naruto nearly missed the last line because it was so quiet. For a moment, he believed his heart had truly stopped there. Did he hear her correctly? She was expecting a child, and he would soon become a father. At that moment, nothing else seemed to matter, and that was all he could think about. All discussion between Hinata and his repo life ceased at that moment. He wanted to kick himself because it was now so clear. He knew he would love their child because he loved Hinata. That love was greater than anything the repo man could ever give him. Everything had suddenly become so quiet that Hinata was at a loss for what to do. He still hadn't spoken after nearly a minute had passed. Was he pleased, upset, or let down? She hoped he would be happy, but all she wanted was for him to say something. Now that everything was suddenly so clear to him, he knew what his future held. He would marry Hinata, raise their child, and grow old together with no problems. That's when he realized it had been more than a minute since anyone had spoken. At that moment, he stood up, circled the table, knelt down, and took both of her hands in his. He looked up into her eyes, which were already beginning to well up with tears, and said, "Hinata, you've just made me the happiest man in the world right now." Then he reached into one of his pants pockets. He opened the box and found a gold band with several small diamonds encircling a large diamond. "I've been waiting for the right time to ask you this, and I doubt that a better one is going to come along anytime soon," he said. "Would you make me even happier?" Tears were streaming down her cheeks by now. She dreamed about this day and envisioned it in a variety of ways, but none of them came close to the actual event. She was so overcome with emotion that she was unable to speak. All she could do was nod her head in silent agreement. After placing the ring on her finger, Naruto stood up, dragged her to her feet, and gave her a hug as if he would never let her go. To be honest, he thought that arrangement sounded perfectly acceptable. Hinata was so happy that she was crying uncontrollably by this point. She no longer cared about anything else. His peculiar demeanor, his relentless work ethic, and the fact that he was a terrible cook. It didn't matter anymore. They were getting married, they were expecting a child, and everything would work out. Nothing, well, except the thought of Orochimaru's impending retirement, could bring Naruto down from his haven. However, he believed that he had given the man 7 years of his life, and that it was now time to start thinking about himself. This was it. No turning back and no accepting no as an answer. He hurried over to the receptionist. Her voice was too sweet as she said, "Ah, hello Naruto, nice to see you again." When asked, "I assume that you're here to see Orochimaru?" Naruto simply nodded in agreement. She pressed the button to open the doors and said, "Well, you're in luck because he's currently free. Oh, and by the way, congratulations on your engagement to Hinata. She really is such a nice girl." He focused all of his attention on the man seated behind the desk in the center of the room, not even bothering to answer the girl. In an overly cordial tone, he said, "Ah Naruto-kun, what a surprise, I thought that you would be too busy to come and see me tonight." With a hint of heat in his voice, he said, "I assure you the last thing that I wanted to do today was come and talk to you." "Oh, then if you don't mind my asking, just what are you doing here then?" replied he. Shutting his eyes, Naruto collected his strength. He just said, "I want out." With curiosity, he inquired, "Out? Out of what?" He would attempt to reason with the snake man. It wouldn't be appropriate to lose his temper at this point in the conversation. "I've been your repo man for more than 7 years now and I can't keep doing this anymore. It's not like there aren't others that can take my place." His voice did not reveal any more emotion than usual as he asked, "You're quitting then, is that it?" Naruto simply gave a head nod. "That's understandable, I guess. You're in love, you have a family to consider now. You can't keep running off in the middle of the night now." Naruto was now beginning to worry. This was not how he had anticipated the conversation to proceed. He was perplexed by the man's composure and found it impossible to discern the man's thoughts due to his inability to read emotion in his voice. I understand, really I do. I'm a family man myself, you know. And you're right, there are others that could take your place, and you have given me over 7 years of your life, far longer than any other repo man I have on staff. Maybe it is time for you to retire. I'll tell you what, you finish up the week's work and I'll call us even. I'll even keep all you secrets. Well, secret. He cracked a smile at the end. Naruto was shocked to discover that he was suddenly free. The snake had even consented to conceal both his life as a repo man and the death of his mother. He would normally be suspicious, but right now he was too happy to give a damn. I have to say I'm a little surprised that you're taking this so well, not that I'm complaining, of course. He concluded with a warm smile. No, it's okay. You've done a lot for me and Gene Company over the years, so it's only fair that I return the favor after all. Naruto turned and left the room, saying with genuine gratitude, thank you. Really, you have no idea how much this means to me. Only after the doors had closed did the Orochimaru's smile fade. The plan did not include this. In addition to being the most proficient and successful repo man he had ever worked with, Naruto was the only one who had survived 2 years without burning out. In fact, he had a whole psychiatric hospital dedicated to burnouts. Naruto was the best repo man he had ever had. The final product was better than he could have imagined after years of molding and guiding him in his quest to create the ideal killing machine. He could kill without regret, but unlike so many other experiments, he was still able to lead a normal life. Hell, he could have kept up with him in his little word games if he had been around for a few more years, which was pretty amazing. Naruto's kids came to mind just thinking about him. How he had grown disillusioned with them. Even when he wasn't comparing them to Naruto, when they were the biggest failures, it still disgraced the lot of them. He had attempted to mold them into ideal substitutes for him while he was away, but all he received were a group of conceited sociopaths who would make better organ donors than deserving heirs. He was furious because he had lost his only real success and no one had stolen from him, which is precisely what that slut of a Hyuga had done to him, sealing her doom. The only things left to decide were when and how, preferably in a way that would entice Naruto to return to his embrace. In just 2 weeks, he and Hinata had managed to put everything together, though he wasn't totally sure how they had done it. He now found himself waiting for his bride to walk down the aisle in front of the priest. He looked around the group of people who had arrived and was waiting for her. Neither of them had a lengthy list of acquaintances they considered friends. Even though it was a small wedding, many well-known people attended, and they even had Sakura perform at their reception. But above the crowd, 2 men were clearly visible. When he had first appeared, Kakashi had declared that he would not miss anything that spared him from paperwork. But even the Hokage's arrival wasn't as unexpected as the next visitor. Naruto knew why he was there, much to the surprise of everyone else. Well, not everyone, because Orochimaru and his 3 children had arrived shortly after Kakashi. Fortunately, it appeared that Orochimaru had instructed his children to sit down, keep quiet, and refrain from making a scene. Along with the majority of the hospital's higher-ups, there were also several Hyuga. Fortunately, it had stayed low-key and small. But as soon as the organist began to play and he saw his sweetheart in her exquisite wedding gown, he was snapped back to reality. All other thoughts vanished from his mind at the mere sight of her. She looked so stunning in her white dress that he was in awe. If he had been wondering if he had made the wrong decision, they were all gone now. Her lavender-pale eyes were concealed by her veil, and her gloved hand held a lovely bouquet. He was confident that he had made the right decision and that having Hinata by his side would make the future better no matter what. When she eventually arrived at the podium and turned to face him, all he could see was a tiny smile. But it was the most exquisite thing he had ever seen, and he knew he would remember it until the day he died. He thought the service was all the more special because it had been so straightforward. He and Hinata were mingling with the rest of their guests after completing their first date as husband and wife. Naruto was attempting to become as small and uninteresting as possible because he didn't want to get caught up in a boring conversation where he had no idea what people were talking about, while Hinata was interacting with others. However, he felt someone grab him by the shoulder and drag him back into one of the more private sections of the garden where the reception was being held, giving him the impression that this was not going to happen. He spun around, braced for battle, but was confronted by Kakashi, who was dressed in his cage robe and hat, his customary mask, and a slanted headband. He only said, "Yo," and flashed his trademark smile. Naruto's only reaction to his old sensei's strange behavior was to grow. It was no secret, at least between the two, that they were not as close to their senseis as most students were, and vice versa. "Hello Kakashi. Sensei. It was nice of you to come, surprising but nice nonetheless." "Well, it's not every day that one of your old students gets married now, is it?" replied the professor. He chuckled at his own joke, saying, "Besides, it got me out of the office for the day, and that was a good enough reason for me." After years of trying to read Orochimaru, he had gotten pretty good at figuring out people's intentions, though he still struggled with it. "I imagine, I have enough paperwork to do on my own, and that's just for the one part of the hospital. I can only imagine what it's like for the entire village. But I doubt that you pulled me all the way over here just to complain about your workload, so why don't we stop acting and you tell me whatever it is you want to so we can get back to everyone before someone starts asking questions?" Suddenly, the tension in the air thickened and Kakashi's eye hardened. "I wanted to ask if you had any idea just what you've done. Do you really think that you're going to be able to keep your nightly adventures a secret from her? Have you even thought about what it will do to her when, and it is a when, she finds out that you've been living a double life, that there's a completely different side to you that she had no idea about when she had agreed to marry you?" By this point, Kakashi had backed Naruto up wall and was looking him straight in the eye. He said, "Actually sensei, the thought had crossed my mind once or twice," with a tone of cynicism. "As of last week," he said, "and, not that it's any of your business, I am no longer a repo man for Jinko. I had decided that some things were more important than a job. I've decided to leave that part of my life in the past. Now I really think that we should be getting back before people start to wonder just what it was we were doing back here." He then passed by Kakashi, who was silently cursing that no one had bothered to inform him that there had been one fewer repo man on the streets for the previous week. It was long after midnight. He was aware that he ought to be sleeping, but he was unable to do so. For more than a month, he had been unable to get more than a few hours of sleep every night, regardless of what he did. He initially believed that he was simply getting used to not having to be out and about at 3 in the morning. Not only that, though, he had also been agitated and fidgety. It would have been an understatement to say that he was somewhat disturbed by his problem, which he had only recently discovered. He lost out on everything: the rush of the opportunity, the strength he experienced each time he put on the mask. He felt as though he had lost a piece of himself because he missed being a repo man, which had been a part of who he was for so long. However, the image of Hinata on their wedding day always popped into his head whenever the idea of rejoining came up, and he managed to suppress those thoughts once more. He loved her too much to do that to her, so he was unable to do it. Therefore, his only option was to keep himself occupied and hold out hope that eventually he would be able to permanently put that aspect of himself behind him. It did not make Orochimaru happy. He had already noticed a change in the quantity of repossessions more than 2 months after losing his best repos man. He had been barely able to keep up with everyone who had fallen behind on their payments, even after bringing on 2 replacements. Furthermore, the organs they had been sent to rest were frequently entirely butchered and useless. He had always known Naruto was the greatest, but it wasn't until now that he realized how much he had grown to rely on him. Getting his repo man back had become his top priority. However, how? That was the thought that constantly occupied his thoughts. He couldn't simply murder his wife and hope that he would return to him. No, subtlety was required in this situation. There was no assurance that he would get his repo man back, but it wouldn't have been difficult to set up an accident to kill her. No, he required a solution that would ensure he regained his repo man, preferably permanently. No, he needed leverage. Something he could hold over his head for as long as he wanted, more than simply killing his wife. Kiba blurted out, "Fuck dad, why don't you just kill the idiot and be done with it?" Orochimaru asked angrily, "And what makes you think that I'm thinking about Naruto?" He occasionally felt that it would have been better to just get rid of his bad kids and start over, but that was no longer an option because they were all too well known and someone would notice if they disappeared and begin to inquire. In his father's office, Kiba threw himself across one of the couches and said, "You're always thinking of that fucking moron now. Because, unlike some people I could name, he's actually has skills outside of killing people indiscriminately," Kiba replied. "It's just a matter getting him to use those skills for us." Kiba, who had never particularly liked the fact that his father thought about the blonde so much, threw his hands up in frustration and said, "Then fuck, I don't know, just threaten his wife and kid or something." A good idea, if a little blunt, except for the fact that I would much prefer not pissing of a man that knows how to kill someone better than most seasoned Junin. How ridiculous could he really get? Even though he hadn't been a ninja for nearly 5 years, he was still one of the village's most proficient killers, and now his boy wanted to threaten him. Was he really that stupid as to believe that he would prevail in a fight? Given enough time, he wasn't even certain that he would prevail. Then it occurred to him that he could use his child against him. He would kill that cursed Hyuga after she gave birth, then blame Naruto for her demise. He would then intervene and give him a way out, giving him something to cling to for the rest of his life in addition to getting his repo man back. It was flawless. He looked amusedly at Kiba and remarked, "You know, son, sometimes I wonder just why I keep you and your siblings around." Then one of you goes and says something helpful. He was in a panic. Last night, it had occurred. He had just finished telling her about his day at the hospital, and they had been eating dinner like any other night. Hinata had always demanded that he tell her about his day, even though nothing particularly noteworthy had occurred. She had mentioned feeling faint at that point. Naruto was out of his char and by her side in a split second, even though he knew that this feeling wasn't particularly unusual for pregnant women. But it was only when she had actually passed out that he became seriously concerned. So fast that he snatched up the bridal style and ran to the hospital. Before the doctor emerged, he must have been pacing back and forth outside the examination room for well over 2 hours. His expectations had not been met by the news. It appeared that Hyaden's mother had experienced the same mysterious blood ailment as her sister. There in the hospital hall, he broke down, and he wasn't ashamed to admit it. He was no longer a 10-year-old boy who barely knew what he was doing, but it was his mother all over again. He was going to find a cure, he was not going to lose her, and he was the greatest medical genius of the century. He would never lose her, no matter what he did. Thus, he was now in the one room he had believed to be permanently behind him. Although a thin layer of dust had now covered it, the room still smelled of blood. All of this was irrelevant, though, because he would be spending most of his time in this room over the next few months, and it was where he kept all of his medical supplies. Though he was unsure of how he would accomplish it, he was certain that he would find a cure. Hinata would survive, and they would age together. This could not have gone any other way. Time had lost all meaning for him as the hours stretched into days, days into weeks, weeks into months. He had become so consumed with finding a cure that he had stopped visiting the hospital altogether and only went outside for supplies and food. He split his time between caring for his sick wife and working in his lab. The hospital's doctors had pretty much given up on Hinata and had let her go so she could live a comfortable life at home. His appreciation for his mother teaching him the Kagebushin had never been greater. In addition to being able to spend all of his time with Hinata, he had been making significant progress every day by working on the problem of finding a cure with at least 10 people. Time was running out, though, and he knew that no matter what he did, she would not live to give birth to their child, who was due at any moment. That didn't matter, though, because he was so close, just a day or two more to add the final details, and it would be done. But that was not going to happen. He sensed one of his clones dispersing, a sudden rush of information. It appeared that her health had deteriorated, and he was in danger of losing both his wife and his unborn child, but it was too late. He seized the incomplete remedy, ignoring the repercussions, and hoped it would suffice. Just seconds after receiving the barrage of information from his clone, he ran up the stairs 2 at a time and entered their room. She was coughing and sitting up in bed, looking even weaker than he remembered. The mere sight of her was enough to make his heart ache. He ran to her and yelled, "No, God no, not now." He could tell that her time was almost up even without his medical training because she was coughing up blood now and had blood-shot, unfocused eyes. As soon as desperation gripped his heart, he realized he was running out of time and had to decide whether to give her his incomplete cure or let her die. He hurried to try to console his dying wife by leaning over the bed. Now that he was crying, he was hugging her to his chest and leaning in to whisper in her ear something about sweat. After gently placing her back on the bed, he turned to take the medication he had placed on the nightstand and prayed silently that it would be effective. He only received a slight nod when he said, "Honey, please can you hear me?" At the end, his voice cracked uncontrollably as he said, "Good, good." Now please just drink this, I promise that it will make everything better. Once more, he only received a slight nod. He carefully inserted the medication into her mouth and anxiously awaited its effects. But it appeared that not only did his medication not work, it actually made her condition worse. Watching his wife begin to bleed from her eyes, ears, and nose while the blood she had been coughing up earlier seemed to have intensified, all he could do was fall to his knees in horror. No, no, gods no, not again, he exclaimed, his eyes streaming with tears. Why could he never be happy? Why did he always have to be the one to lose everything? His mind was racing with all of these ideas and more. His gaze immediately went to his dying wife's swollen stomach as he looked up at her form. He would do everything in his power to save his child if he was unable to save his wife. He refused to lose it because, at this point, he needed something to cling to, and if it couldn't be his wife, it would be his child. He picked up his wife's bleeding body and carried her down to his hidden operating room while he quickly tried to gather his thoughts. The procedure was straightforward, but Hinata had slipped halfway through because it had been too much for her already frail body. With his new daughter in his arms, wrapped in a blanket, Naruto now sat on one of the chairs strewn throughout the room. But Naruto was no longer alive. He had just shut down, no thoughts were going through his mind, and he was unaware of the additional weight in his arms. He was completely numb, and even the sounds emanating from the house were so muffled that they could not be distinguished from one another. Unfortunately, he was too stunned to notice the new people in the house. Before long, he was being pulled to his feet and the baby. His baby was being removed from him. At that moment, he jolted out of his daze. No, no, I can't lose her either, he cried to himself. He fought back against the two Anbu preventing him from moving forward. They were attempting to take his daughter, who was all that remained of her. They were attempting to take her away from him, and she was the only thing in the entire world that gave him hope that he was anything but a monster. He shouted, "No," before overwhelming an Anbu who was attempting to hold him and flinging him over his shoulder onto one of the room's metal operating tables. He then turned and forced one of the Anbu to release his arm by punching him in the face. He turned to face the female Anbu who was currently holding his daughter after he was released from the two people restraining him. But because of his mental state at the time, he failed to notice the fourth Anbu, who managed to approach from behind and use the ring end of a kunai to strike him in the back of the head. His entire body hurt, not just his head. He couldn't think clearly, he didn't know where he was, and the last thing he remembered was holding his daughter. His daughter, his wife's death, the operation, holding his daughter, and the Anbu all came flooding back to him. He had lost her to them. Straight up, he glanced around. It was clear that he was in some kind of holding cell, most likely at Anbu headquarters. The room was square and made of stone. Other than himself, the room was empty except for a big metal door, a hanging light, and a tiny wooden bunk. But the last thing on his mind was the room's contents. The guilt began to take over now that his previous numbness had been knocked out. Even the old guilt of killing his mother returned with a vengeance, as did the guilt of killing his wife in order to save their daughter. The guilt and death were too much for him to handle any longer. He cast a disgusted glance down at his hands. Not only was he unable to save those closest to him, but he was also the reason behind their deaths. What kind of doctor was he? The purpose of these hands was not to save lives. He could see now that they only knew how to kill. He quickly thought about his new daughter. Would she become like the others, and would he eventually find himself looking down at her dead body? No, no, he wouldn't even consider that. He would do everything within his power to protect her. Now that she was the only positive thing in his life, he would do whatever it took to keep her safe and shield her from the outside world. But these ideas quickly returned him to his current situation. If he were trapped here, how could he possibly protect her? He was sitting there for an hour or two, but he had no idea how long he had been there. But before he knew it, the sound of metal scraping against stone jolted him out of his reverie and into reality. The last person he had anticipated was standing in the doorway. Even if it had been Kakashi or some other anonymous Anbu, it would have made sense, but he couldn't figure out why Orochimaru was standing there. With a worried tone in his voice, he said, "Naruto, my boy, I came as soon as I heard." Naruto had never heard the man say this before. "They're saying that you murdered your wife. Though I'm sure this is just some horrible mistake. If you just told me what happened, I'm sure that I could fix this if you just told me what happened." Normally, Naruto would be suspicious of the man who offered to help him, but he was desperate at the time and was more than happy to accept the Snake Man's assistance. He then recounted how Hinata had become ill, how he had searched for a cure for months but it had only made matters worse, and how he had to have surgery to keep at least one of them alive. Well, that is quite a tale, and if it makes you feel any better, I agree. You didn't have any other choices available to you. Unfortunately, I doubt that many others will see it that way. You know how people are always looking for the easiest solution to their problem, always looking to place the blame on someone. Orochimaru replied with a shook head in human beings. Please, I'm begging you. I know that you can fix this. You're one of the most powerful people in the world. Naruto collapsed to his knees in front of the snaky man, declaring, please, I'll do anything. Just let me be with my daughter. He was desperate because this was his only chance to be free and be able to watch over his and Hinata's child. Well, I imagine that if I vouched that you had no choice, that Hinata was already dying and you had been forced to make a choice between losing both of them or just one, that they might be more lenient. They may even acquit you altogether, and if you were still my repo man, I would without giving it a second thought. But if memory serves, you stopped working for me almost 9 months ago. And therein lies the problems. I can't go around vouching for just anybody. If I did that, just imagine all the people who would come to me for help. Then again, if you were to become one of my employees again, well, then I would be only too happy to help. After all, it would be bad press if one of my employees was found guilty of killing his wife, now wouldn't it? He asked, now struggling to keep the satisfaction out his voice. The man was asking Naruto to become one of his repo men again, and Naruto understood exactly what he was asking. Every time the idea of returning to being a repo man crossed his mind, the picture of Hinata on their wedding day flashed before him. It had almost become second nature to think of her. However, he recalled that she was no longer alive and that he was no longer concerned about her opinion of him. Then he saw a picture of his newborn daughter. Was he really going to put her through this? However, what sort of life would she lead if he were confined to prison? No, he had no other option. The answer was obvious. He would sell his soul to the devil once more, and this time he was aware that he would be under the Snake Man's control for the rest of his life. However, he was content as long as he could keep her safe. His voice broke at the mention of his daughter. Fine. I'll be your repo man. Just give me back my daughter. Please, I'm begging you. She all I have now. With that, he turned back to the door and left. Well, then, let me be the first to welcome you back. Now let's see what I can do about this whole mess. Leaving Naruto still kneeling on the ground, crying. Here, in the shadows, encircled by darkness, was his home. It seemed as though the night had anticipated his return and was still prepared to greet him after all this time. Perhaps he had known all along that he would never be able to be apart from her for very long. Even as a child, he had always loved the night, and it had always been there for him, loved him, and protected him. In many respects, it had been his first love. She had been the first person to be kind to him while he was still homeless, protecting him from those who would have harmed him and giving him cover to steal the food he needed to survive. She had loved him without conditions, and he had loved her in return. After being adopted by his mother, Evan remained there overnight, anticipating his return. And when he did, she had still loved him, providing him with all the moonlight he required to perform his duties while concealing him in her deep shadows. He loved her even more because she had never been critical of him or disappointed in him. All he had ever wanted was to be loved, and all she had ever done was love him. Now that he was back, she still loved him, embracing and caressing him in her dark embrace, and he loved her even more. Knowing that he would always be loved and that he was determined to show his daughter the same love that the night had given him throughout his life was consoling. He would never leave her side, he would guard her as the night guarded him. But that was all for the future. Right now, all he wanted to do was lose himself in the darkness and forget about the events of the previous day. Deep down in his heart, he could feel the loss of his wife even here, in the tender embrace of the night, tearing him apart from the inside out like a black hole. No, he had to concentrate. He couldn't be thinking about her right now. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it. He couldn't get sentimental now. Even though he had been out of work for nearly a year, nothing had changed. In fact, people appeared to have become more daring than he had recalled. She was just out on the street, walking home from what looked like a party, whereas normally his targets would be at least a little anxious. He could only shake his head at some people's lack of intelligence. He had been concerned that he would become rusty after all this time, but that concern seemed unfounded. Even though he was directly behind her, she had failed to notice him, presumably due in part to her intoxication. But as he extended his hand to grab her, it stopped, and a picture of Hinata with a dissatisfied expression on her face appeared. He shook his head, remembering that he had committed to doing this in order to care for their daughter. He extended his hand to grasp her once more, but the picture of his daughters appeared before his hand had even reached halfway. He shuddered at the idea of what she would think of him as she grew older, the idea that she would despise him and call him a monster. No matter what she thought of him, he had to do this because he loved her, and this was the only way he could be there to keep her safe. Without having time to think, his hand sprang out this time, grabbing her by the nape of her neck before stabbing her in the lower back, effectively paralyzing her from the waist down. She screamed and fell to the ground. Without even considering her, he flipped her over and sliced through her shirt, revealing a toned stomach. After that, it came naturally, almost instinctively. Before removing the large and small intestines and cutting the tissue holding the liver in place, he removed the skin and muscles surrounding her midsection. He then tore the liver out of her now dead body. It took no more than 4 minutes total. His concerns about becoming rusty appeared to have been unjustified. That was it. The Repo Man had returned, and he was as vicious as ever. That made Naruto reflect. He hadn't done this in nearly 9 months, but it still came to him so naturally. Building up that persona from scratch should have been more difficult because he believed he had finally banished that aspect of himself months ago. He could recall all the pain he had experienced in the beginning, and he honestly could say that he didn't think he could take much more and still cling to whatever sanity he still had. However, it seems that the Repo Man in him was harder to get rid of than he had thought, and maybe that was a blessing. However, he still had to deliver this specific liver to Orochimaru, so all of these thoughts were just distractions. After securing his belongings in the cooler section of his bag, he got up and headed down the street, frantically trying to focus on delivering his package and returning home to his daughter. How did this happen? That was the query that Hakata Kakashi, the village's former Hokage, concealed in the leaves. Even after reading the report twice, he was still unable to comprehend what had transpired. Even though she had been out of the field for months, it was still a blow that he had lost one of his most promising tracking nin in the span of 24 hours. Even worse, one of the village's most brilliant medical minds, who also happened to be the late Hinata's husband and his former genin student Naruto, quit his job at the hospital and, in the eyes of the public, isolated himself in his home. Regretfully, it wasn't just that. His former pupil appeared to have returned to his life as a Repo Man. Nevertheless, he was powerless to change it. Even though he detested it, he was powerless to stop Jinko and their Repo Man from doing whatever they pleased. Even though he was the village's military leader, he still required the council's approval before he could take any action pertaining to civilian or economic issues. In addition, Orochimaru had nearly all of the council members at his disposal and had witnessed what had happened when the third party attempted to meddle in the affairs of the now largest cooperation on the continent. No, he would need someone on the inside if he wanted to succeed with Jinko and the Repo Men. They had closed their doors and waited until so many people had died that the third had no choice but to allow them to do whatever they had wanted. The issue was that he had no idea how he was going to get someone into the Repo Men, since they had never really clicked and Naruto had been a Repo Man for longer than a ninja or doctor. He had initially considered him but had promptly written him off because he couldn't be trusted to go behind Orochimaru's back. Thus, the most obvious approach remained. To learn how Gene Company and the Repo Men recruited new members, he would simply have his spy snoop around them. It was only a matter of who now. A further issue was that few people were willing to work as Repo Men. Even for ninjas, the position seemed especially shady. Most of the ninja in the village were known to pulse Orochimaru, so if one of them asked for a job out of the blue, he would probably be suspected. No, he needed someone who wouldn't raise any red flags, or at the very least, not raise suspicions that they were spies. He couldn't think of many people that he could immediately think of, or at least none that could play Repo Man for very long. No, that wasn't totally accurate, he could think of only one person. Now that he thought about it, she was ideal. Nobody would suspect her of being a spy because she simply wasn't the kind, and she was already disliked by the majority of the villagers. You will become missing. Nin if both of your parents disappear. Additionally, she was already a clinical psychopath, so she would likely seize the opportunity to murder people every night. It was ideal. The only possibility he could think of was simply getting her in, but they could figure that out later. XXXXX people were not Anko's thing. Never would be, never had been. Regretfully, it appeared that this moron had missed the memo. He slurred, clearly intoxicated, "Hey there hot stuff, what's a place like this doing in a girl like you?" Anko's eye twitched. Why did some moron always try to make out with her whenever she went out to get wasted? She was not a slut just because she liked to dress like one. It did not define her as such. In addition, the man must have been nearly twice her age. The man in his 30s slurred, what's the matter, think you're too good for me or something? Once more. She thought to herself, fuck YHA, she was too good for him. To be honest, what kind of pervert approaches girls as young as 15? Especially one as attractive as her. The drunk sitting next to her was not pleased that she was now becoming irritated. He grabbed her arm and said, "Fucking bitch, who y'all think y'all are ignoring me?" The idiot ought to have simply left, however, if he wishes to act rough, then so be it. He doubled over after she jerked her arm out of the drunk's grasp and elbowed him in the gut. She then raised her fist and struck him in the nose. The man dropped to the ground, clutching his bloody and broken nose. He exclaimed, "Arg, you fucking bitch, you broke my nose." With a sharp kick to his ribs for good measure, she said, "Maybe now you'll know that, fuck off, means just that." Then, after attempting to get plaster in the bar, she turned and left. A few hours had passed since the drunken incident. Anko had already been ejected from multiple bars and was now completely inebriated. She was now staggering back toward her apartment through the deserted streets of Kanaha. Overall, the day had been a huge success. She was intoxicated and had managed to cause harm to someone. What more could she ask for? Unfortunately, things were going to get much more complicated for her today. A shadow jumped out at her as she was ready to turn down the street that would lead to her cozy bed. She leapt back and assumed a fighting stance as instinct took over. Since this was not the first time a foolish villager had tried something, she was hardly shocked. She did, however, feel a little more at ease as soon as the person entered the light. Since no one in Anbu had yet to attempt her murder, he had a legitimate desire for something else. She was more inebriated than she had realized when she heard her own slurred words escape her lips. "Ya know it's not polite to startle a girl like that." The Anbu simply shook his head at the visibly inebriated Kanonichi, SP. He had no idea why the Hokage would want to talk to someone like her, but his job did not require him to comprehend his cage's innermost thoughts. He only needed to convey a message. "Mitarashi Anko, you are to report to the Hokage at 0900 tomorrow." "Well, aren't we straight to the point, mister?" Anko asked him, staring at him blankly. There was no small talk anymore. She turned away from the stuffy Anbu and started to walk back to her apartment, not really in the mood to mess with it like she usually would, thinking about why the Hokage had personally visited. Fine, I'll be there now if you'll excuse me, I happen to have a sleep cycle to maintain, so I'm just going to go home now." Being called to a meeting with the Hokage was generally regarded as either a very positive thing, such as receiving a sudden promotion, or a very negative thing, such as receiving a sudden promotion and then being sent on a suicide mission. Given her past, it was highly probable that this meeting would not end well. Kakashi was in his office the following morning, wondering if anyone would notice if he simply burned the papers on his desk, when the doors were thrown open and an apparently inebriated Anko rushed in, shouting something about how she had never seen that man in her life. His only response to the seeming denials coming from her mouth was to blink, or wink, in his case, owlishly. "Oh, I'm not entirely sure what you're talking about, but I think you might be a little confused about why I called you here." With hesitation, she said, "So this isn't about the bar fight last week?" He asked the now agitated girl in front of him, "What bar fight?" Anko congratulated herself on steering the conversation away from potentially dangerous situations. "Bar fight? What bar fight? I never said anything about a bar fight. You're getting paranoid in your old age, you should take some time off or something. But we're not here to talk about some imaginary bar fight now, are we? You called me here, so I assumed that you finally realized that I'm far too badass to be some random chunin and have decided to promote me to full junin, right?" Right, anyway. I'm not entirely sure what you thought that this meeting was about, but I assure you that you're not in trouble. I actually have a mission for you. Now before I begin I want you to know that this is entirely optional, but no matter what you decision this meeting is classified and no matter what must stay secret. Do you understand? He asked with the most authoritative tone he could muster. Whatever she had been anticipating, this was not it. It sounded like fun, and based on the information provided, it was a very high-level mission. The fact that it was optional could only indicate that it was extremely difficult, dangerous, or both. You bet. The idea of completing what seemed like a very significant mission made her hangover go away. Glad you understand. Now what can you tell me what you know about Gene Company, more specifically about the repo men they employ? Replied he. She may have been too young to be impacted by the widespread organ failures that had paved the way for the company's success, but it would have taken blindness, deafness, or living under a rock her entire life to not at least be aware of them. And it would be obvious that this mission had something to do with them if he was inquiring about them. Nothing more than most people, I would imagine. Heck, I've never even seen a repo man in the field before. She replied openly. She had heard stories, to be sure, but that was all. I see. Well, that's not really important anyway. Now the reason that I called you here was to ask, and I do mean ask, this isn't an order, you to infiltrate the Repo Men organization and to be my inside man, so to speak. However, before you say anything, let me tell you that this will not be an easy assignment. Orochimaru is no fool. He's not going to take the chance of hiring one of my active ninja for fear of my getting a man in his organization. If we're going to make this work, you will either need to quit or be dishonorable discharged from the ninja ranks. Even then, it's no guarantee that he'll recruit you. In fact, I'm not entirely sure just how new repo men are recruited. That will be up to you to find out. Even if you are successful in joining, you should know that being a repo man is not the same as being a ninja. Believe me when I say that there's a much higher burnout rate than even Anbu. In fact, as far as I've been able to tell, there's only been one person to have lasted any significant amount of time. Now, knowing all this, do you accept this mission? Believe me, there will be no hard feelings if you decline. I wouldn't even want this assignment. He was serious too. He had been in Anbu for almost 6 years before he went back to being a regular Junin, and he had no trouble saying that in those 6 years he hadn't seen anywhere near the same amount of death as a repo man would have in half that time. Though, to be honest, he wasn't totally certain that his old genin hadn't lost it somewhere along the way and was simply a very good actor. The fact that Naruto hadn't gone insane yet still astounded him. Anko was taken aback. This was not the type of mission you would send a Chunin on, and she seriously doubted that many Anbu would be capable of carrying it out. However, she was at a loss for words as she stood before the man who had just asked her if she wanted to work for the most powerful and influential company in the world. On the one hand, if you succeeded in this mission, you would be promoted all the way to Anbu. However, he had essentially informed her that she would have to finally give up her ninja skills for the duration of the mission, and that there was a good chance the job would make her even more insane than she already was. She snorted to herself, aha, right, like that's possible. Who was she to say that this sounded like the greatest mission ever? Well, except that she knew that there probably wouldn't be much of a body to find later if she was discovered. She didn't mind, though, because without risk, it wouldn't be very enjoyable. Hell yha, I'll take the job, it sounds like fun. At her, Kakashi could only shake his head. She clearly didn't know what she was getting herself into. Even he wasn't totally sure what he was getting her into, but he couldn't help but hope that the girl in front of him didn't end up the same way after picturing Naruto in that clearing back in wave and the madness he saw in his eye. He selected a paper from a pile on his desk and said, "Very well, we'll start tonight. As of right now, you have been dishonorably discharged from the Ninja Corps of Konoha for behavior unbecoming of a ninja. You can take that however you want. Now, unfortunately, there's not much known about repo, so you're going to have to spend your nights out looking for them. I would suggest starting with the residential district. It seems to happen around there the most," he stated. Anko simply nodded. It looked like this job would be enjoyable. The head repo man was practically an urban legend in his own right, so she might even get to learn who he was. Good, now get out of here. We'll set up a dead drop system ladder once you've gotten yourself settled. After stopping at the door and giving the Hokage a fictitious salute, Anko stormed out of the office. After nearly a week of working at it, she had yet to see a single repo man. There were at least 10 of them operating in the city, so she should have at least seen one of them. It didn't make sense. To date, however, she had only been able to locate the disfigured bodies of several villagers. She was becoming so frustrated that it was becoming more and more appealing to simply walk into the Gene Company building and request a job application. But as soon as she felt the cool metal of a scalpel against her neck, her frustration vanished. "You're rather persistent, you know? It's been a week now and still you haven't given up. So that either means you're one of the more dedicated girls I've seen running around the city, or you have something important to say." If I were to guess, I'd say it was former, but I could be wrong. "So which is it?" the individual in front of her inquired. How in the world did this guy surprise me? In her mind, she screamed. She decided to risk looking over her shoulder at that point. "It's him!" she screamed in her mind once more. Among all the repo men she had anticipated encountering, the head of Gene Co's repo branch was the last. But the sensation of the sharp metal against her neck quickly forced her to return to her original purpose for being there. "Right. Well, it's just that, I'm kind of looking for a job and well, I thought that I could, you know, be a repo man, air person." Fuck, what's wrong with her? Just now, she sounded like a scared little girl. "Stupid girl. Do you have any idea just what it means to be repo?" "Don't answer. Of course you don't. If you did, you wouldn't be here asking me this." That was all she received. When she was insulted, all of her nervousness vanished, and a feeling she was much more used to took its place. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not like she hadn't killed anyone before. "Hey, fuck you. I'm not just some stupid little girl. I'll have you know that I was a Chunin level ninja until recently, and I know damn well what repo men do. Fuck, I've already got a body count that would make most Junin look like pussies." She could hear the amusement in his voice as he said, "Is that so? Well then you'll have to excuse my ignorance. I wasn't aware that I was talking to an experienced killer. Now then, other than what I'm sure is an impressive body count, why exactly do you think you would make it in repo?" he asked, still with a hint of amusement in his voice, after removing the scalpel from her neck and turning her so she was staring him in the eye. "Fuck it, just go with your strengths," she proudly stated. "I'm not squeamish around blood if that helps. I'm also pretty damn good with a blade if I do say so myself." She really didn't have much else that qualified her for repo. In fact, she didn't even know what the hell they looked for in repo man candidates. "Fine. You think you can cut it then show up at the Gene Company building tomorrow and hand the receptionist this card. Then we'll see how things go." He gave her a red plastic card that was no larger than a business card, turned away, and began to leave after standing there silently staring at her. It was actually getting a little unsettling, and she couldn't help but fidget. She questioned bewilderedly, "Wait, is that it? I just show up and bam, I'm in?" He finished, and without even waiting for her to answer, he turned around and left. "Of course not. That card will get your foot in the door. After that you'll have to meet the boss man and convince him." She had never spoken to the man directly, but she was aware of his reputation, and she was determined not to offend him, even though she knew that being discovered as a Hokage spy would be a surefire way to do so. Despite this, Enko knew that accepting the mission would be risky. All she could do was try to be convincing and hope the man would believe her. Since ninja were not permitted to run across the building's roof like the rest of the village, she had never really had a reason to be this close to the complex. To say that the Gene Company building was large would have been an understatement. Its tallest point was easily twice as tall as the Hokage building, and the entire complex stretched out for nearly a quarter mile. In addition, the Gene Company building was much darker, composed primarily of steel and concrete rather than the stone used for the majority of the other buildings in the village. This created the impression that the complex was not even a part of the same village. She quickly overcame any anxiety the building may have caused her, though, because she couldn't afford to lose control of her emotions at this point. She had a meeting with one of the most influential people in the world, and she couldn't let him know why she was there. After all, this is a man who will harvest people's organs if they miss even one payment. She was grateful that she had never fallen for the whole new organs as a fashion statement, so she plucked up all the courage she could muster and entered the room wearing one of her trademark sexy smirks. The building's exterior was somewhat deceptive, at least in terms of creating expectations about what the interior would look like. In contrast to the gloomy and dreary impression that one would get from looking at the exterior facade, the interior looked like what one would expect a hospital to look like. Clean tiled floors, white walls and ceiling, and everything was lit by numerous fluorescent lights. It was actually a little confusing, something that was likely done on purpose, though she wasn't sure why. She shook off her uneasiness and surveyed what appeared to be a hospital waiting room before approaching the nurse working the front desk. She approached, but the gentleman behind the desk ignored her. "Hello, I was told to give this to the person at the front desk." She handed the girl on the other side of the desk the red card the repo man had given her the previous evening. After giving the red card a quick glance, she abruptly straightened up and said, "Of course. Now let's see." She then turned to the schedule book and started looking through it. "All right, Orochimaru. Sama is waiting in his office. Just take the elevator to the top floor and speak to the secretary there." "Thanks." She then just walked past the girl to the bank of elevators, and after a brief ride, she found herself in a much more opulent waiting area. She approached the receptionist without giving her surroundings any thought, but the woman behind the desk interrupted her before she could say anything more. She smiled amiably and said, "Ah, Miss Mitarashi, we've been expecting you." "You have? Wait, how do you know who I am?" she asked, perplexed. She knew she had never been here before, even though her name wasn't exactly top secret. Now that would be telling. "Now I believe you have an appointment to keep. Don't want to keep the big man waiting, do we?" the receptionist said, laughing lightly, before pressing the button to open the doors to the Orochimaru's office. Right. She entered the office of one of the most powerful men in the county, if not the entire world, with a somewhat puzzled expression on her face. He was sitting behind his desk, smiling at her in what she could only assume was a friendly manner, though it appeared to be predatory to her. Perhaps this was just her imagination. She soon realized they weren't alone, though, as the same repo man she had met on the street was standing off to the side. In his overly cordial manner, he said, "Ah, Anko-chan, I'm so glad that you could make it. I was almost afraid that you weren't coming." It only took a moment for her to gather herself before she responded, like I would pass up a chance like this." She wasn't sure how to react to that, and hearing someone like Orochimaru call her Anko-chan made her unsteady. "I'm glad to hear that, really. It's not very often that I get someone with shinobi training wanting to join my little organization. For some reason they seem to find what we do." He took a moment to determine the correct term. Distasteful. Even Anko recognized the hypocrisy of that, but it was the opinion of the majority of ninja. "Well, I'm not most people. Besides, what the hell else am I supposed to do? Become some merchant or something? Well, fuck that." The majority of ninja she knew found the concept of repo men repulsive, not because they killed people. After all, shinobi did the same thing every day, but because they saw themselves as defenders of their village and carried out their duties in a selfish manner. Coo. I must say I do admire you, Spunk. Now on to business." He then took a file folder from a stack on his desk and said, "I've already read through your shinobi record and I must say that I'm impressed. After all, not many people make past their first Chunin exam, wouldn't you say?" Finally, he turned to face the repo man who was standing off to the side. "Not to mention the fact that even at your young age you already have a number of successful A-ranked missions under your belt. It makes me wonder just what Kakashi-san was thinking dismissing such a promising young Kanonichi. I don't suppose you would be able to shed some light on that?" he said, maintaining a friendly smile without any accusatory tone. Anko was left stunned, thinking, how the hell did he get a copy of my records? They're supposed to be sealed and only other ninja are supposed to have access to them. Then he gave the only other man in the room a look that made it clear he was referring to the man's own Chunin exam, which meant that he had also passed it on his first try, so clearly he was, at least at one point, a ninja as well. Finally, the man all but accused her of being a Hokage spy, but she was able to gather herself and respond, "Fuck if I know. All I did was start a few bar fights and the one-eyed bastard gets all bent out of shape." Coo. Yes, your file dose mentioned that you don't exactly play well with others. He cracked a chuckle. "Not to worry though, you'll find that here at Jinko we're a bit more accepting of people's quirks. So long as you get the job done, everything else is inconsequential." He glanced over to the repo man's side and then returned to Anko. "Now seeing as how you're still here, I'll take it that you're sincere in joining up, so just let me say welcome Gene Company and that I'll be watching your progress very carefully. After all, there's only 2 other repo men with shinobi training here in Konoha and I'll be expecting great things from you. Oh, and Naruto-kun, I'm trusting you with her training. After all, you are the best and who better to learn from?" Naruto, where have I heard that name before? She asked herself as she followed the repo man back to the elevators, but he didn't say anything until the doors had closed. The repo man, who was apparently Naruto, simply nodded and started to leave the room. His mask muffled his voice, but he still sounded young. "You shouldn't have come. I honestly had hoped that whatever common sense you had would have told you that this was a bad idea." She was a little irritated with the man standing next to her. She wasn't a little child. She knew what she was getting herself into. "Aha, well, what are you going to do? Besides, like I told the big guy upstairs, what else am I going to do for work?" she asked. "The way you dress, I could think of a few professions." A joke. She had never thought that the day would come when she heard a repo man make a joke. "Don't look so surprised. Repo men are just as human as ninja. Anyway, seeing as how there's nothing I can do about it now, I might as well show you around." At that, the doors to the elevator opened up in what appeared to be the basement of the building. "Come on. The entrance is just this way." And with that, he walked out of the elevator and walked down the poorly lit hallway until he reached a dead end. However, after pressing a number of random-looking bricks, a section of the wall opened up to reveal a well-lit corridor. Simply signaling her to follow him, walked down the hall and opened up a frosted glass door to what seemed like some kind of lounge. "This is our head office. Over there," he pointed to one of the doors on the right, "is the training room. You'll be spending a lot of time in there for the next few weeks. And over there," he pointed to another door at the back of the room, "is the entrance to the tunnels that go under most of the village. Finally, there's the meeting room, storage room, and my office, as well as a number of operating rooms on the lower level. We also have a dormitory downstairs, but most people prefer to sleep at home." He pointed out the direction of each room as he named them off. "Now come on, we still have some work to do to make you an official repo man. Air girl." And with that, he walked over to the door that he had pointed out lead to his office and opened the door for her. Taking a seat behind his desk, he rummaged through a beat-up filing cabinet for the proper paperwork. "Here, all you need to do is read this over and sign wherever it tells you to." With that, he tossed a number of papers at the girl. "Now, while you're doing that, let me just give you a brief run though of what your training will involve. Thankfully, you've already made your first kill, so we don't have to worry about getting you used to that. Instead, you'll be shadowing me for at least a month from Monday to Friday. At the same time, you'll need to read up on not only anatomy but basic medical knowledge. I'll give you a list of books to read before you leave, but you'll be expected to read them on your own time. Once I think you're ready, and only when I think you're ready, will we move on to hands-on training. We'll start out with cadavers and work our way up until you're ready to go out into the city and kill your own targets. At this point, I'll be the one shadowing you for a week or two. If after that everything looks good, I'll say you're good to go and you'll be working solo from then on. Overall, this should at least take up to 6 months. Any questions? No good. Once you're done, there will get you set up with some proper equipment and a uniform." Without even reading the rest of the papers in front of her, she signed her name where it was needed and said, "Well then, what the hell are we waiting for? Let's go." Even Ninja, who generally detest everything repo, had to admit that their costumes were pretty badass, and now she was going to get her own. Naruto simply laughed at her excitement and said, "Well, someone's excited." He rose from his chair, opened his office door, and escorted her to the storage room, saying, "You'll find a locker with your name on it. You'll find your uniform as well as your basic equipment in there. Once you're suited up, we'll head out." With barely restrained joy, she rushed into the room and said, "Right, whatever you say, boss man." She changed into her new uniform in a matter of minutes, and it was better than she could have ever imagined. The mask was pretty much the same as Naruto's, except that it had no bottom, so her voice wasn't muffled. Hers, on the other hand, was nearly the exact opposite of his, being a black leather shoulderless dress that hung down to her mid-thigh, a black vinyl apron that was the same length, a pair of black boots, and gloves. Picture in profile. He turned and left the room through the door at the back, which he claimed led to several hidden tunnels that led to different locations throughout the village. Good. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's go. She was a little disappointed that she couldn't get a rise out of him. After all, she was certain that she could attract a blind gay man with this. "So what exactly are we doing tonight?" she inquired. He tossed her a piece of paper. "Just one repossession tonight. I thought that we would start things off simply," he replied. She simply looked down at the piece of paper and nodded her head. It featured an image of what appeared to be a young man with the words, "Repossession," printed over it. Along with the organs that needed to be repossessed, it also included his home and workplace addresses. It was his large and small intestines in this instance. "So what exactly is the plan? Are we just going to stake out his house, or are we going to go looking for him?" She was genuinely curious about how repo men identified their targets because it would be foolish for someone who had missed a payment to simply be wandering the city. Still moving down the tunnel that seemed to lead to the residential district, he said, "We'll check out his house first. If he's not there, we'll check the route he takes to his place of work. If that doesn't work, we just going to have to stake out his house. However, you'd be surprised at how often I find them just out on the street. What kind of idiot would just be walking out in the open when they knew that they had a repo man coming after them?" she asked with disbelief. He shrugged his shoulders at the thought of people being so foolish, saying, "I used to wonder the same thing, but it makes our jobs all the easier. Besides, it's not like we send them a notice or anything. In any case, when we do find him, I want you to hang back and watch, at least until I have him down." She was actually a little irritated, saying, "Whatever, less work for me then." She could easily deal with a random villager, but if he wanted to do all the work, then so be it. Unfortunately, they had not been able to locate their target on the streets for several hours. As a result, they set up shop on the building across the street from the man's flat. "How long exactly are we going to wait for him? It's already 3 in the morning, if he hasn't come home yet he probably isn't going to," asked an irritated Anko. Naruto was limited to shaking his head. "We've only been out here for 4 hours. There's still plenty of time for him to show up. Besides, the bars will be closing soon. Chances are he knew that he had missed a payment and went off to get drunk." Anko simply gave a head nod. She should have done the same thing, but to be honest, she would have been out drinking even if there hadn't been a repo man pursuing her. Fine, whatever you say." Fortunately, their target staggered down the street toward the building they were observing a few minutes later. He leapt from the building and vanished into the darkness after saying, "There he is. Now stay here until I have him on the ground." In fact, Anko was taken aback by how effectively he was able to hide. She couldn't see him, so she focused on the man they had been anticipating. He had a rather normal appearance, but he was obviously intoxicated. At that moment, she saw that Naruto had managed to get behind him and was now slowly approaching from behind. She saw his hands reach out, grab him from behind, and force his head against the wall of the building next to them when he was standing directly behind him. Then he gestured for her to join him downstairs. She was standing next to him in a matter of seconds after jumping down to the street below it. After giving her a final glance, he reached down, took one of the blades he had kept in his boots, and leaned over the man. When the man opened his eyes and moaned softly, she realized he was still alive. The fact that Naruto ignored the man's groans and started slicing into his torso shocked her even more. The man began to thrash around at that point, and the screaming began. But it didn't change anything, and soon the man's stomach area had a big hole in it. He finished a few minutes later, and his bag contained both his large and small intestines. He stood up and began to leave, but Anko remained standing where he had been. She was reviewing what she had just witnessed in her mind. She had done that before and it didn't bother her anymore, so it wasn't that he had killed the man. She had never stayed behind to disembowel them afterwards, though. It was simply professional courtesy, and she had always taken pride in making a clean kill. However, before he cut into the man, he hadn't even made sure he was unconscious. He shouted at her from the other side of the street, "Common kid, we don't have all night." On their way back to deliver the organs they had just regained, they found themselves back in the tunnels. Naruto wasn't much of a talkalist, and Anko was still absorbed in her thoughts about what she had just witnessed. The silence was only broken when they returned to the main room at the repo headquarters. A black-haired man who was probably no older than 20 asked, "Hey Dick. Les, who's that?" Underneath his black trench coat was a white apron that coincidentally had blood on it. He was seated on one of the couches that were arranged throughout the room's lobby. Naruto was only able to sigh. He turned to her and said, "She's the new girl. Anko, this charming fellow is Sai. He's the second most senior repo man and also in charge when I'm not around. Sai, this is the new girl, so play nice." With that eerie fake smile, he asked, "When am I not nice, Dick? Les?" Then he turned to face Anko, and his expression briefly changed to one of contemplation. Then he extended his hand to shake her hand. Even after Anko's fist struck it and threw him across the room, he maintained his fake smile and said, "Hello, my name is Sai. It's a pleasure to meet you, flat chest." He then walked back to the storage room with Anko in tow, saying, "Don't mind him, he may be a complete sociopath but he's still the only other repo man in Konoha that has any extensive ninja training. Now come on, the nights are almost over and I want to get home as soon as possible." He went to the back of the room and vanished around the corner after saying, "You can just hang your stuff up in your locker, but once you start to kill your own targets there's a shower room back here that you can hose the blood off in." This was her opportunity. After all, she had no idea how long she would be able to serve as a Hokage spy, and learning the identity of the head repo man was at the top of her priority list. She also had to admit that she was interested in seeing what kind of person could accomplish what she had just witnessed him accomplish. The last person she ever imagined seeing in the repo was there, so she changed back into her street clothes and crept back to the shower room. The greatest medical genius of his generation, perhaps even surpassing his adopted mother, the renowned medic Tsunade, Naruto Senju, was a repo man and the head surgeon at Konoha Hospital until a few weeks ago. It was nearly impossible to believe. In fact, she was certain that she would have laughed in their faces and left if someone had simply approached her and told her that. Although she was too young to have known him at the academy, she had undoubtedly seen him at the hospital and around town. She could say with confidence that he did not appear to be the type of person who would be involved in repo because he had even been her doctor when she broke her arm during training a few years prior. He was standing there, however, hosing the blood off his suit. He didn't even look at her, but he said, "I know what you're thinking. How can someone like me do something like this? Right? The truth is I'm just as crazy as everyone else, probably more so. The key to this business is not to not lose your mind, but to lose on your own terms. Me, I came to the conclusion that as Naruto, the doctor, the person that I simply wasn't able to do what I had to do. So in a sense I decided to stop being Naruto when I was working, and now, in effect I'm almost two people sharing the same body, almost being the key word there, but it works for me. Sai is a sociopath, so has no moral compass to tell him if what he's doing is right or wrong. All repo men that last any significant amount of time have to be at least a little crazy. So now I ask you, after everything you've seen tonight, knowing exactly what it takes to make it here, do you still want to join? Because this is your last chance to just walk away." Continued to stare at her, finished without even looking at her. Anko's thoughts were racing. Was she truly motivated to do this? Was this a good idea? When he gave her this task, the Hokage gave her an out, so it's likely that he would understand that she didn't believe she could complete the mission. She had also learned more about repos than any outsider would likely know from this one night alone. However, after seeing the pictures of everyone who had called her names or told her that she would never succeed as a ninja because she was related to two missing nin, her resolve was strengthened. No matter the consequences, she would not give up now that she had come this far. Fuck that. People already tell me I'm batshit crazy, so no worries there. Besides, I'm already here and I'm far too lazy to start looking for another job now. And remember to start reading those books. Remember, our job isn't to kill people, it's to get back Jinko's property intact. Alright then. He turned to face her and said, "If you're sure, then meet me here at 7 on weekdays. We'll do training until 10 and then go out and do the same thing we just did." He then began to walk past her back out into the now empty lobby. "Now we're done for the night. I would suggest you go home and get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long night." She had been working on it for 3 months, and she was certain that her priceless dango was the only thing keeping her sane, or as sane as she was prior to embarking on this mission. Anyway, dango would have to do for the time being, because the only thing better would be a lot of alcohol, but since she was now a civilian, and therefore under the current drinking age limit, that was no longer an option. She still had nearly 4 hours before she had to report to work, and it was still early in the afternoon. There was only one place to be, of course. Nearly 2 years ago, she discovered this small gem and fell in love right away. Though it wasn't particularly attractive, they had the best dango in the village, and it was also one of the few places where she could eat without people making fun of her, at least not because of her past. Some people still didn't like her clothes, but that was their problem. Therefore, she bought a plate of dango almost every day and went to a deserted place to eat and read again. She would never have guessed how much you needed to know about the human body before she had actually joined Repo. Hell, if she wanted to, she could probably become a medic.nin after this, though she had no plans to do so because she preferred hurting people rather than helping them feel better. The idea of medic.nin unintentionally made her think of the man she was training under at the time. The fact that the man teaching her the correct technique for removing a person's heart was also the former best surgeon in the village had taken her more than a few days to get over. After all, both jobs required knife skills and an understanding of the human body, so it made some grotesque sense. The only real distinction between the two occupations was that repo men don't replace the organs they remove. She was also a little taken aback to learn that the Hokage was aware of Naruto's presence in the repository and that, reportedly, he had served as his genin sensei. She was still in training, so she didn't have access to anything too sensitive, but regrettably, since then, she had only learned the names of the other repo men and nothing else worth telling the Hokage. However, if all went well, she would soon begin practicing on humans. She was forthright enough to acknowledge that she was a little anxious about it. Not about killing people, which she had no problem with, but about hanging around and removing their organs. Cutting into someone while they were still alive was a different matter entirely from practicing on someone who had already passed away. But as soon as a shadow passed over her, she was startled out of her reverie. She was shocked to see one of her few friends in the village when she looked up from her book. She and Karana had both graduated from the academy together, and despite playing for different teams, they were still able to stay in touch. Sadly, they haven't had a chance to meet up since she agreed to the mission to infiltrate the repository. "What's up, Karana? Chan?" she asked, standing there with her constant reprimanding gaze. Although Anko genuinely liked her, she occasionally felt that the other girl should lighten up, get laid, or do something else. She tapped her foot and said in a holier than thou tone, "Don't you, Karana? Chan, me. It's been almost 3 months since I last saw you, and what's this I hear about you being stripped of your ninja status?" Anko could only rub the back of her head and laugh feebly. The girl who was now seated across from her gave her a curt nod when she asked, "Heard about that, did ya?" She wished she could tell her friend the truth, but she knew better than anyone how many resources Gene Company had, and she really didn't want to try her luck any more than she already was. "Bah. Nothing to worry about. Sooner or later they'll realize just how awesome a ninja I was and come begging me to come back. The way I see it, I'm just on an extended vacation." As the other 15-year-old girl put it, "Honestly, Anko, sometimes I wonder about you. One would think that being discharged as a ninja would make you take life a bit more seriously, but here you are the same as always." "Hey now, that's not true. As you can plainly see, it's well past noon and I'm not drunk. I would think that would make you happy. And besides, maybe it's not me not taking things too seriously, but you who need to loosen up, think about it," she said with her best portrayal of an old wise man. Karana practically hissed, "Damn it, Anko, I'm not the one who lost my job because I have an attitude problem." That was quite a slight. Anko hissed in response, "Now what the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means that you got fired because you have the mental maturity of a 5-year-old. Not to mention your lack of any kind of a temper or professionalism, and don't even get me started on the fact that you're a borderline psychopath. Seriously, it's a wonder that you even made it to Chunin." She exhaled. "I had hoped that maybe this would have been like a wake-up call or something, but I can see now that you're not going to change for anything." What the fuck? Where in hell did she get away with telling her that she was such a screw-up? Furthermore, it wasn't as if she allowed her behavior to interfere with her mission or anything else. What the devil did it have to do with anything? And she spent enough time with them to know that she wasn't a psychopath. She might have been a little sadistic, but she wasn't a psychopath yet. It was a little early, but she would much rather hang out in the lobby at Repo HQ than hang out here and have the chance of running into Karana again. She practically yelled, "Well, fuck you too, you uptight bitch," as she rushed out of the little dang stall. She changed into her Repo uniform and returned to the main lobby, lounge room, still in a rage. Unfortunately, she wasn't alone there, though it's questionable who she was there for. She had grown accustomed to Sai's strange behavior over the past few months, but she wasn't in the mood for him today. "Hey flat chest, you're here early." She then delivered her strongest blow, sending him flying into one of the walls before he could retort any more insults. The only other repo man in the room said, "Not that we don't appreciate you shutting him up for a few minutes, but you mind me asking what's got you in such a foul mood today?" Takashi was his name. When he was younger, he was an orphan who did not complete his final year at the Shinobi Academy. Regretfully, she didn't know much about him other than the fact that he was probably the most sane person here. He had only been doing this for a little over a year, so he was still the most typical person in the repository. Even though he was normal, this was still Repo, and she didn't want to get all worked up over a pointless argument, so she waved him away, saying, "It's not important. By the way, where's the captain? I know I'm a little early, but I saw his stuff in the locker room." He appeared to consider it for a minute before he realized the solution. Aha, he came in early today. Probable a big job down in one of the operating rooms, didn't seem particularly pleased to be called in early either. "Thanks, Kashi-kun." She waved as she moved toward the door leading to the operating rooms. But she stopped just as she was ready to enter. There seemed to be music playing in the background for some strange reason. She opened the door as silently as she could. But she was caught off guard by what she saw, or more crucially, heard. Before the now vertical table, Naruto was there, seemingly ready to begin operating on the writhing man. But he was singing instead of being silent as usual. She remained where she was and began to listen as intently as she could, concluding that this was definitely not something to miss. It's a grateful job, but someone has to do it. He made his first cut here, totally unaware of the man's cries. The tissue is peeling off inch by inch. Skinnin, off the muscles, too. The man's large and small intestines were now protruding over the edges of a large hole in his chest. "I'm harvesting the fall crops. 7, up the livers in the fridge." The man's previous screams had turned into labored breathing, and he was now nearly dead from blood loss. "When I'm finished, nobody ever thanks me. How self-absorbed people can be." He then reached into the newly created hole and started to remove the man's large and small intestines by grabbing one of the big plastic tubs that were resting on one of the tables around the operating table. The other man's eyes lost their last glimmer of life at that moment, and he was pronounced dead. With a snip or slice, eeny, meeny, miny, moo, after finishing the man's gastrointestinal tract, he reached up into his chest until his arm nearly vanished into his torso. He took it out quickly, now clutching his heart. With a stitch and a cut, returning organs good as new, he then, while humming to himself, packed up all of the organs he had repossessed into separate bags and kept them in a freezer off to one side of the room. This job is thankful, but somebody's got to do it. He then nearly danced to the man he had just killed, whose body was now cooling, and rammed his arm back up onto him until it nearly vanished. Like a mop, he sung, altering his voice as he moved the man's lips. The words, "and a broom." He withdrew his arm from the man's torso. "A thankless job is not what anyone want," with an overeducated bow, he concluded. After concluding that what she had just witnessed was indeed what had happened, she was momentarily unable to speak as her brain took some time to confirm whether or not what she had just witnessed was real. Catching himself off guard by the Sudan noise, Naruto spun around and quickly realized what had happened. The newest member of the repo was standing in the doorway, nearly laughing. Feeling embarrassed at being in such a slightly awkward situation, all he could do was rub the back of his neck. You've been standing there for how long?" The idea that she had discovered one of the village's most feared men practicing his ventriloquism on the corpse of his most recent repossessions was simply too humorous. "Oh," she said, wiping a fake tear from her eye, "oh, this is just too good. Wait until I tell the rest of the guys." She had thought that a normal person would probably find the entire situation horrifying, which reminded her of her previous augment with Karana. "Well, fuck her, I like who I am and I think this is funny." Unfortunately, that entire line of thought ruined her positive mood. "Laugh as much as you can, yeah," he said angrily, "but after 3 days of not sleeping, I need something to keep myself occupied with. Now come on, I have something for you." He then walked past her, gesturing for her to follow. As she followed him down the hallway, she couldn't help but notice that they were going to one of the other operating rooms rather than back up the stairs to the common room. He pushed open the doors after saying, "I decided to speed up your training because I have to admit that you're progressing much faster than I thought you would initially." Anko knew what was waiting for her behind the door before it was even opened. She had already begun studying human corpses, so that left only one possibility, and she was correct. Strapped to the table was a man she had never seen before in her life. Not that that wasn't common, after all, the village was rather big. He took her hand and put his trademark double-bladed scalpel in it, saying, "Since this is your first repossession, I decided to keep it simple. All you have to do is remove the man's heart." She just looked down at the sharp surgical knife in her hand, then back up to the man standing beside her. All he did was give her a reassuring nod before gesturing for her to get started. She gulped in nervousness. This was going to be her first real repossession. She had practiced before on cadavers, but it just wasn't the same thing. Taking a deep breath, she slowly walked up to the operating table to get a good look at the man she was about to kill. He was probably only in his mid-20s with long, scraggly brown hair. He wasn't wearing a shirt, leaving his chest bare. It was when she was about to make her first incision that his eyes snapped open in fear and looked wildly around the room. It was when he saw the knife in her head that he started yelling. Well, trying to yell, he was thankfully gagged. She was a little startled and looked back at the man standing by behind her. She may never have said it out loud, but over then months she had become to idolize her sensei. He had taught her more than her genin sensei had ever, not to mention he, as well as the rest of the people in Repo, had treated her better than almost all of the other people in the village, and the thought of disappointing him left a bitter taste in her mouth. So she gathered her convictions, remembered what she had been taught, and began to cut away the skin and muscles around the man's rib cage, all the while his screams had become more and more willed. She had cracked open the man's ribs with some difficulty before cutting the still beating organ out and placing it in a plastic bag that Naruto had handed her. Overall, it had taken her 5 minutes, a little slow. She knew that the blonde standing behind her usually could have done it in less than 3, but for her first time she was rather proud of herself. All doubts about herself that her argument with Kurana forgotten in the face of this accomplishment. The man behind her said calmly, "That was rather impressive for your first time. A little slow, but that will come with practice." Any squeamishness she might have had at slicing open a man was swiftly banished at the price she paid for what was rapidly becoming the most important person in her life. Not that the list was particularly long to begin with, mind you. But, damn straight it was impressive. But seriously, what were you expecting? I mean, this is me we talking about. The pudding face she gave him made him laugh. Of course, what was I thinking, doubting you? What was it again? Oh yes, your kick-ass awesomeness. Hey now, you know that I'm the only one around here that's allowed to tease people. If you start doing then, so will everyone else. Then I'll have to find a new thing to call my own, and I'm far too lazy to do that. She laughed. Repo girl, say whatever you want. Simply put, I'm happy that you're feeling better. Come on now, the nights are still young, and I still have work to do. He waved his hand, and they were both gone. Anko was currently lying on her bed in her small apartment. She had just come back from a meeting with the Hokage and was really in no mood to be out amongst the general public. It had started off like always. He asked her if she had seen or heard anything suspicious. She told him the same thing she always told him, that she was still a trainee and they sure as hell weren't about to tell her about their plans for world domination yet. Normally that was it, but today had been different. Instead of just accepting that she really didn't know anything, he had started to ask her about how her personal life had been going. Well, she certainly didn't appreciate the man sticking his nose in where it wasn't wanted, but couldn't really just tell him to fuck off. He was the Hokage after all. That had gone on for an uncomfortable 20 minutes, accumulating in her realizing that her personal life sucked. After her argument with Kurana, she had distanced herself from the other girl. Not that that was her fault, mind you. The entire meeting had ended with the Hokage warning her about becoming too attached to the people she was supposed to be spying on. She had simply scoffed at the man's warning and walked out of the building. However, now that she had had some time to think about what he had said, she found that he might have been right. She was honest enough to admit that the only reason she had found she had no problem playing spy was because there simply wasn't anything to spy on at the moment. However, the thought that sooner or later she was going to be in a position where she was going to have to make a choice that could very well get not only Orochimaru in trouble but maybe all the other Repo men as well. And that was a though that she found left her feeling very guilty. She would admit that over the months she come to see the Repo men in a different light. Well, they may not have been the sanest of people she had ever met, they had almost become a kind of family, a feeling she was rather sure was not unique to her. Sai may have been annoying, but he was almost like that crazy uncle every family has. And Takashi played the role of big brother, even though he was hardly the oldest or most senior Repo man. It really wasn't that surprising to her. Most other Repo men had almost no life outside of the job, so all they had was each other. Then there was Naruto. She wasn't entirely sure what role he fit into. He seemed to take it upon himself to play several. One moment he's acting the father, trying to keep the rest of the repo men in line. Then he switches over to being everybody's little brother, trying to make people laugh, and then he switches to playing the overbearing mother, which for the record is a rather disturbing thought, making sure everyone had their paperwork finished and that they kept their equipment in clean and put away in their lockers. She had actually laughed the first time she saw him chew outside for leaving a bloody knife on a stack of magazines in the common room. However, it was the thought of getting the blonde in trouble that bothered her the most. He had taken her under his wing and had in his own silent way shown her more kindness than anyone else had in her life. She wasn't entirely sure what she felt for him: admiration, respect, maybe love. She really couldn't give the feeling a word. And if it came down to choosing either her mission or him, she really didn't know which she would choose. "Are you certain you're prepared for this? You understand that I'm just going to observe? This is all you?" he asked, and she simply nodded her head in agreement. "All right then," he said, taking one of the folders from his desk and giving it to her. "Okay, let's go. It's going to be a long night," she said, simply nodding her head once more. This was the last part of her training. All she needed to do was demonstrate that she could perform the job, and she would be a full member of the repository. That was still a week or two away, but it wasn't that important at the moment. But before she could show her stuff, she still needed to locate her target, which was proving to be a little challenging. She wasn't at her apartment, her workplace, or any place in between, and it was becoming really annoying. "It's almost 3, and the bars and nightclubs will soon close, so just relax and keep in mind everything I taught you. Just as patient," her sensei said calmly. She tried to calm her frazzled nerves by thinking, right, all I need to do is take a few deep breaths and calm down. The night's still young and she has to come home at some point. However, she was unable to calm herself no matter what she did. This may have been her first time tracking her own targets, and she knew that she would have all week to prove herself, but she still wanted to impress her sensei by getting it right on the first try. Unfortunately, it seemed like the gods were against her on this particular night, as the heavens opened up and it began to rain. Perfect, just perfect. She mumbled to herself. This was exactly what she needed, and now she was soaking wet. She had been sitting out in the rain for almost an hour now and was in less than happy. She almost felt sorry for the person she had been waiting for, because she knew that she was probably going to be less than gentle with them when they finally decided to come home. As if on cue, she noticed a person walking along the road in the direction of the apartment she had been staking out now for well over 2 hours. Unfortunately, it was too dark to identify them from her current hiding place, but it was almost 4 in the morning and the chances it was not the person she had been looking for were slim. Looking back at the man that had been teaching her for almost half a year now, she nodded her head in the direction of the person down on the street. All the response she got was him giving her a nod of his head, as if to say that this was her repossession and he wasn't going to do any of the work for her. Shaking her head, she jumped down of the building and tried to hide herself in the shadow like she had seen Naruto do on many occasions. Now she was no slouch when it came to stealth and all that, but for the life of her she just couldn't understand how he had become so good at it. It was like he almost melted into the shadow themselves. However, despite the fact that she was sure she would never be as good at hiding as her sensei, she was still competent, and in no time at all she had been able to get a good look at the woman that was now approaching the apartment building she had been watching, and sure enough it was the same woman she had been waiting for. Deciding that it would be best to get her before she entered the building, Enko put on a burst of speed, and in less than a second she was standing behind the girl that could be no older than 25. It was now that her training kicked in. Not quite as confident in her skills as the man who was no doubt watching the entire thing from back up on the roof, she decided to just slit the girl's throat so she wouldn't have to deal with her kicking and screaming. Tightening her grip on the knife in her hand, she slowly reached out and in one quick movement she grabbed the girl's head in her free hand, pulling it back to expose her slender neck, and in a flash of dragged the knife across, resulting in a large spray of blood and the girl suddenly going limp in her arms. Letting her fall to the ground, she kneeled over her, quickly cutting through her cloths, revealing the skin underneath. Deciding that this was no time to be taking chances, she slowly and methodically cut away the skin and muscle around her stomach area and pushing both large and small intestines out of the way so she had a clean shot at the woman's liver. After that, it was almost too easy to remove the large triangular organ and place it in a plastic bag. That dawn she stood up and started to walk back to where she had thought that Naruto had been waiting for her. However, as he had done on many occasions to her, instead of simple jumping down of the building, he walked out of the shadows to the side and gave her a start. No matter how much time she spent with him, she still had been able to track the man once he had gone all stealthy on her, Damn it. How many times do I have to tell you to wear a bell or something? She called out cheerfully. Her spirits still high from her first successful repossession in the field. Well, that would kind of defeat the purpose of hiding now, wouldn't it? Besides, I doubt that even if I was wearing 100 bells you'd be able to find me. He laughed. Well, as soon as you find a suit with 100 bells on, we'll test that theory, but until then, she said, holding up the bag containing the liver, why don't you throw me the storage bag so I can put the sucker on ice and we can get out of here? It's almost 5 and unlike some people I do need my beauty sleep. She was able to shake her head at him, even though he might have been more insane than she was. But he was still enjoyable to spend time with, at least most of the time. As he tossed her the big leather bag used to carry organs, Naruto simply chuckled at his student's antics and said, all right, we're done for the night. All we have to do is drop this off back at Gene Company and you can go get some shut-eye. As she followed the blonde man back down the streets toward the Gene Company complex, she made what sounded like a joyful chirping sound at the thought of a warm bead. Well, how am I doing? Please let me know if I was as amazing as or not. Still feeling elated from her first repo, she asked. He didn't even need to look to see the disappointed expression on her face when he said, well, you were a little on the slow side and some of these cuts seemed kind of sloppy from where I was watching. But overall, I have to say that I'm rather proud of you, kid. I've seen gown men do much worse on their first time, not that I'm all that surprised. I knew you were going to be among the best the moment I saw you wield a knife, and you just confirmed my prediction. Her face glowed with excitement. He was proud of her, and she meant no one. He had also declared her to be among the best. She had never doubted her own greatness, but it was nearly too much for her to handle when someone else saw it too. She let out an almost ear-splitting squeal and threw herself at her sensei's back, wrapping her arms around his neck. Ack, leave. In between choking breaths, the blonde said, I never would have said anything if I knew you were going to throw yourself at me at every little compliment. Hee, sorry about that. Just don't get that many compliments coming my way, you know. She jumped when she realized she had made a fool of herself and gave herself a sheepish neck rub, something Naruto did and apparently influenced her to do. He said, struggling to contain his laughter so that he sounded at least slightly irritated, it's fine, really, just remember next time to keep your feet firmly planted on the ground and for the love of God never squeal like that again. But really, was I fucking awesome or what? Whatever you say, boss man, she said, mockingly saluting. She was finally in. After only a week of observation, Naruto had said she was ready to start working on her own as a full-fledged repo man. It may have taken her more than half a year, but she had done it. Unfortunately, this brought up some serious moral questions on her part. Namely the fact that she was now in a position where it was rather likely she would come across information that could potentially get Gene Co., as well as the other repo men, in a lot of hot water. And although she, as well as most of the other repo men, was never very fond of Orochimaru, she really didn't want to get Naruto and the others in trouble. They had almost become the family she never had, and the thought of them going to jail or worse left a very bad taste in her mouth. However, that was not the issue right now, and the only solution she had come up with so far was to simply focus on her work and hope she never came across any information that would put her in a place where she had to choose between them and the village. So with her rather flimsy plan in mind, she shoved all thought of the future aside and instead focused on the job at hand. This was her first time working solo, and she was determined that nothing was going to go wrong so long as she had any say in it. Not that she thought that this was going to be anything other than a standard repo, but she'd be damned if she let Naruto Sensei down now after he had put his confidence in her. So remembering all the thing he had thought her, she was now staked out on the building opposite from the apartment complex her target was supposed to be living. And sure enough, after only an hour of waiting, there she was. A rather unassuming girlie, probably no older than herself if that, with long brown hair and a liver that was now 90 days past due. Shaking her head to clear it of all thoughts about her double life, she jumped down of the building and rushed at her target, deciding that as sneaky as she was, it was just faster to rush them and be done with it. Circulating chakra through her legs, she was able to close the distance before the girlie even had time to react to her. Taking a note out of her sensei's notebook, she used her momentum and slammed the girl's head into the wall of her apartment building with a sickening crack. Oh well, I wasn't really in the mood to listen to her screaming anyway, she thought as she stared down at the now lifeless corpse at her feet. After that, it was all too easy to cut open the girl and remove her still warm liver. A little anticlimactic for my first time solo, but no complaints from me, she thought as she packed the organ for transport. Stepping back and wiping some of the excess blood of her gloves, she turned around and started to walk off. A week. She had been a fully fledged repo man for a week now, and still the thought of spying on her colleges left a bitter taste in her mouth. She knew that she could no longer put it off like in the past. The Hokage would undoubtedly be on her back demanding results. Hell, she had a meeting scheduled for the next day and she already knew what he was going to say. The only problem was that she had nothing to report, despite what he obviously thought repo men really weren't told anything all that secret, except for Naruto, she supposed. He was the head repo man for not only the village but all their other operations around the world, and the thought of breaking into his office was something she really didn't think she could do. She owed him too much to do something like that to him. But she could already hear the Hokage's voice in her head telling her that her loyalty to the village superseded all others, and that no matter her personal feelings she had a job to do, and if she wasn't able to then he might as well pull her from the mission. And that was something she really didn't want to happen. Arg. Why does life have to be so complicated? She put her head down on her kitchen table in frustration and said, since sitting in my apartment complaining about her life was not helping anyone, I decided to do the only sensible thing any sane person in my situation would do. Go out and get drunk. Most establishments wouldn't serve an underage, civilian, girl, but I'm grateful that I found a particularly seedy bar that had no such moral qualms. Anko wasn't quite sure how long she had been sitting there, but the big pile of sake bottles next to her suggested it had been at least a few hours. However, time seemed to lose all significance when she was drunk, and she was content with her current situation, so thank you very much. What the hell do you think you're doing, Anko? God damn it, from behind her, a strangely familiar voice said, what the hell is wrong with you? It's been nearly 7 months since you were suspended, and you haven't even made an effort to change. Oh, she remembered now. Slurring, she said, hi, it's Karana. Chan, long time no see. And I'll tell ya what's wrong, she said, picking up a bottle of sake. I'm out of sake, she chuckled. Karana's only option was to stand there and appear completely lost. Well, don't just stand there, grab a set and let's get drunk, come on, it'll be fun. That's it, Anko. I'm finished. I've made an effort to be patient with you, but it seems pointless. You're a lost cause, Anko, and I'm washing my hands of you right now, regardless of how much I chastise you. Ah, I'm just having a little fun, don't act like that, Karana. Chan. In addition, I keep telling you that many people like me exactly as I am and that I don't need to change. Now take a seat with your longtime friend Anko and enjoy a drink. No, Anko, I did mean what I said. I simply cannot handle this any longer. I hope you will eventually get your life together, but it will have to be without me. Goodbye, Anko. She then turned around and began to leave. All right, I have plenty of other friends who like me just the way I am, so I don't need you anyhow. You. I'm better off without you anyhow, you uptight bitch. Even more dejected than when she had entered, she turned back to her ever increasing stack of sake bottles and yelled at her old best friends retreating back. She hated the sun, hated it with a passion. It may have been that she had gotten used to working at night, though it was more likely because the large shiny ball of light had had the nerve to shine through her window and wake her up after an all-night binder. YHA, that was probably it. Unfortunately, she wasn't simply able to ignore it today. She had a meeting with the Hokage in half an hour, and even she wouldn't keep the man waiting if she could help it. So growing, she quickly threw off her covers, dashed through her morning rituals, and was out the door, a stick of dango hanging half-eaten out of her mouth as she struggled to get her arm into one of the sleeves of her trench coat. Already she knew that the one-eyed bastard was probably going to chew her out for not producing anything valuable. Not that it was her fault, really. I mean really, I'm just a low-level repo man. I probably had higher clearance when I was still a ninja. However, before she had a chance to continue to think of reasons she hadn't produced any useful intelligence, she arrived at the small tea house that they had been using for their clandestine meetings. Not even giving the old man at the front desk a look, she walked to the back of the store, and there he was, the single most powerful man in the village, sitting on a creative tea, giving her a very stern look. However, it soon morphed into a more natural one and eventually into his patented eye smile. Hello, Anko. Chan. It's been a while since I've heard from you, so it's very kind of you to stop by. His voice remained light and airy as he said, I was starting to worry something had happened. However, Anko was aware that the man was not entirely satisfied with the information she had been able to provide and was probably a little suspicious because she hadn't scheduled a meeting with him for months. Well, what can I say? I haven't had much to report. She hoped her justification would convince him. I mean, I just got promoted to full repo man status, and really repo men don't see anything all that interesting, so there wasn't any reason to risk contacting you, she said. Well, whatever the case, I would still have valued a note from time to time, if only to inform me that you were still alive. I didn't call you here for that reason, though. Recently, I received some rather unsettling news from one of my council sources. It appears that our good friend Orochimaru has been donating a significant sum of money to several charities that are actually run by several council members. He's up to something, and judging by the quantity of gold he's distributing, it's something significant. I need to know what he's planning because you are my only source. In fact, the only source in the entire Orochimaru's organization. You have my complete permission to take whatever necessary action, so I don't care what you have to do to get this information to me. Unless it's absolutely necessary, I would much rather you don't compromise your identity, even if you must. Are you sure? I mean, as far as I know, I'm the only person to have successfully infiltrated Orochimaru's organization? Anko wondered. This must have been bloody important if he was willing to compromise the only source, even if it wasn't a very productive one, in all of Gene Company. Even though I'll do everything in my power to avoid detection, I'm aware that I'll need to break into at least one office, if not more, and the chances aren't exactly in my favor. I understand that it will be difficult and that it will take a miracle to accomplish this while preserving your reputation as a repo man. But there is no use in having someone in your position if you don't use them. However, as previously stated, finishing this mission comes before maintaining your cover. Okay. I'll do it, but I can't make any promises. Her thoughts were racing through all of her memories from that time, and regrettably, she discovered that they were among her happiest. She had been welcomed, cared for, and treated like the family she had always dreamed of. She became physically ill as a result of her sneaking behind their back. Kakashi knew exactly what the girl in front of him was thinking because he had participated in more than one infiltration mission in his life. In these kinds of missions, it was really inevitable that you would have to approach your targets in order to obtain any information. The important thing was to avoid getting too close, which he believed Anko had done. He couldn't really blame her. It was reasonable to assume that she would cling to the first person who showed even a passing interest in her life, since she had spent the majority of her life alone. He had a very real chance of losing his source to the enemy permanently if he added in the fact that the individual had been his former student, who was unconsciously one of the most compassionate, albeit unstable, people he knew. One of the primary reasons he had given it to her was because, if he was being completely honest with himself, he would only give her a 50-50 chance of finishing the mission and giving him the information back. He would have lost one of the more promising ninja of the most recent generation if she didn't deliver the goods and show her devotion to the village. In any case, this was most likely her final act as his spy. That's all I ask, just remember I need this information ASAP. She turned around and walked back out the front of the store and back to her apartment after saying, "Yes sir." What the hell am I supposed to do? Fuck. She slammed her head against her kitchen table and screamed in her head. How could she possibly do it? On the one hand, she was loyal to the village, and on the other hand, Kakashi trusted her to complete this task. She also had Naruto and the other repo men on the other. She had grown to view them as the family she had always desired over the course of the months. They had accepted her for who she was, something that those she had previously considered friends apparently couldn't do. Not to mention what they would think of her if they discovered she had been spying on them all along. The mere idea of betraying them nearly made her feel sick. I really need to relax and consider this. I'm fairly certain that I can obtain the information without being caught at this point. The investigation that follows will most likely lead to my capture. Since it's probably nothing anyway, I'll just find out what the Hokage is looking for and then determine whether it's worth compromising myself for. Now all I have to do is figure out how in the world I'm going to discover anything about what in the world Orochimaru is planning. Regretfully, the only high security location she was authorized to enter was Repo headquarters, and even then, her sensei's office was the only location where she might encounter sensitive documents. He was in charge of all the Repo men worldwide and, as a result, spent a significant amount of time with Orochimaru. Now that she had given it some thought, She realized that there was a good chance that whatever contained the Hokage's underwear in a bunch would likely be in there, or at least she had a good idea of what it was. Actually, breaking in was the only issue. Fortunately, she was aware that Naruto only stayed at headquarters for as long as was absolutely required. In fact, she had never witnessed him stay longer than was required. In fact, she had occasionally stayed, if only to talk with some of the other repo men. Oh well, it only made her job easier. No, the actual issue was that his office door was right off the lounge, so if someone were to walk by, they would probably set off the alarm, and she would be in serious trouble. Oh well, her only option was to use a genjutsu and hope it would withstand any scrutiny. With a clear plan in mind, she arrived nearly an hour early in order to reach her goal, return before anyone else, and execute her plan. Fortunately, it was a straightforward kidney transplant, and the fact that Target had practically bumped into her in a backstreet made for one of the fastest repos ever. When she went to the locker room after dropping off the organs in the freezer, she saw that all of the other repo men had reportedly already dressed and departed. She hurried to the door leading to Naruto's office, knowing that she had at least 30 minutes before anyone would return. She picked up the lock quickly and used a quick genjutsu to make the door appear to be closed. Although it wouldn't withstand close examination, she had never been particularly skilled at genjutsu. She glanced quickly around the rather sparsely furnished room and saw that there were several filing cabinets, a desk, and a chair. She searched the desk drawers first because she wasn't totally sure what she was looking for, and then she moved on to the filing cabinets. She shuffled the papers inside and picked the locks on the drawers once more. She quickly skimmed through the papers and saw that none of them were particularly interesting. Most of the information was about the weekly number of organs repossessed in each village and similar topics, which were intriguing but probably not what she was looking for. It was the same for the other drawers. Unfortunately, the office light flickered on just as she was ready to proceed to the filing cabinets. She spun around out of instinct and grabbed one of the blades she had stashed inside her repo suit. Regretfully, she realized she was completely screwed when she noticed who was leaning against the door frame. She might have been able to fight some of the other repo men if she had been forced to, but she knew she would never be able to defeat a fight, much less defeat the man in the door. His voice was free of any hint of animosity as he said, "Hello Anko-chan." He pointed to the far right wall and said, "You know, if you're looking for the more sensitive stuff, there's a safe the wall over there." She had been caught red-handed, and he continued to treat her as he always had, leaving Anko stunned. He ought to at least be upset or something, but it didn't make sense. He paused and took out a file folder from the inside pocket of his lab coat, which he wore when not wearing his repo suit. "But then again, if you're here for what I think you are, then I'll save you some time," he said. "I think this is what Kakashi-sensei is looking for." He placed the file on the desk. She couldn't understand why in the world he was providing her with the information she needed. She doubted it after spending so much time with him. He might be a little off balance, but he wasn't a liar. The only explanation she could think of was that it was fake or something. "Why are you giving me this? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You know I'm a spy?" "Of course I did. Honestly, Anko-chan, do you really think so little of me? I may not have specialized in counterintelligence, but I'm not blind either. It was rather obvious why you wanted to join Repo." Anko was now quite taken aback. He had allowed her entry despite knowing, apparently from the start, that she was a spy. There was no sense in it. "If you knew I was a spy, then why did you let me join?" "Oh that. Like I told you when we first met, I saw something in you. Potential maybe, or it could have just been that I saw that you were one of the few people that could do this job and not break after a few years, who knows. The point is, I saw something in you that told me you would make a good repo man, and I was right. The fact that you were a spy was beside the point." He concluded gently. "As for why I'm giving you this file, well, think of it like a test, because that really is what it is. And don't give me that look, it's not just my test, it's Kakashi-sensei's too. You have two options and only two. You can either take the file and walk out of here and give it to the Hokage, and in doing so more than likely have a number of people in the company and council arrested, or you can leave the file on my desk, in which case the council will give Orochimaru the power, create a police force to enforce the law in the village, taking away the power of the Hokage to use his Anbu for the same purpose. The choice is yours to make, and if you make the first one, I promise not to stop you." This was not the intended outcome. It was supposed to be straightforward. She would break in, discover that the Hokage had become agitated over nothing, and then she could carry on as she had been doing all along with no one noticing. However, as she stood in this office, forced to choose between two worlds, she realized that there was no longer any middle ground and that she would either become a repo man or a shinobi. She could already feel her resolve eroding as she looked down at the file on the desk in front of her, and she knew instantly what she was going to say.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.